the night the power went out in Los Angeles. It was a warm Tuesday evening, August 14th, 2018, in Westlake, Los Angeles. The sun had just slipped behind the skyline, leaving behind an orange haze that clung to the tops of the buildings. People were still roaming the streets, restaurants were buzzing, and cars crawled along Wilshire Boulevard with their headlights just beginning to glow. Inside a small apartment on Bonnie Bray Street, Eleanor Hayes, a 42-year-old British journalist who had moved from Manchester 3 years earlier, was sitting at her desk. She was finishing an article for a London-based magazine. The only sounds in her flat were the soft hum of her fan and the distant siren of an ambulance heading towards Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At 7:46 p.m., everything changed. The fan stopped. The laptop screen went black, and the entire building dropped into silence. At first, Eleanor thought it was just a blown fuse in her unit. But then a chorus of confused voices rose in the hallway. Someone tried the light switch again and again, as if the fifth flick would magically fix it. From the street below, car horns erupted as the traffic signals died all at once. She stepped to her window and pushed it open. The usually bright stretch of Wilshire was swallowed in darkness. Street lamps, billboard lights, neon signs, everything had gone out. The only illumination came from the fading twilight and the glow of the moon peeking through the haze. Across the street, a grocery shop owner named Miguel Ortega stood in his doorway, holding a flashlight and calling out to people trying to pay for their last-minute purchases. Up the block, a couple argued about whether to stay in their car or walk home. In the distance, Eleanor could hear someone shouting, "Is it just us or the whole city?" Moments later, her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor downstairs, Clara Jenkins, a 29-year-old nursing student from Bristol. "Ellie, are you okay? Everything's out, even the lifts." Eleanor replied quickly, then grabbed a candle from her kitchen drawer. By 8:10 p.m., the streets looked almost unreal. Los Angeles was a city built on constant light. Without it, the shadows stretched long and strange. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the darkness itself had a pulse. From somewhere down Bonnie Bray, a group of teenagers lit sparklers they'd found in a drawer, waving them around like improvised torches. A few residents gathered outside their buildings, speaking in softer voices than usual, as though loud noises might make the blackout worse. Not far away, near MacArthur Park, a bus had stalled in the middle of the intersection. The driver, Sandra Lewis, stood outside the door with a small keychain light, helping passengers step down one by one. One of them, a young graphic designer named Joshua Clark, kept glancing at the horizon, expecting the glow of downtown lights to come back any minute. But the skyline was darker than he'd ever seen it. Sirens began to rise again. First one, then another, then several overlapping. Emergency vehicles were trying to navigate streets choked by stalled traffic and confused drivers with no signals to follow. In Eleanor's building, the hallway smelled faintly of sandalwood candles and warm dust. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another suddenly found themselves standing in doorways, sharing phone torches, checking on elderly residents, and trading guesses about what caused the outage. Someone said it was a blown transformer. Another insisted it was cyber sabotage. A third suggested it was just the summer heat overloading the grid. But no one really knew, and as the darkness deepened, something unexpected began to unfold. Eleanor lit the only candle she had and set it on a small saucer that used to hold her coffee mug. Its flickering glow danced across the walls, stretching the shadows of the furniture into odd, shifting shapes. She opened the window wider to let the hot air out of the room, and from the third floor, she could see more residents stepping outside to the pavement. Downstairs, Claire knocked on a few doors to make sure the neighbors were all right. In apartment 3B, An elderly man from Liverpool named Robert Kensington grumbled about not being able to finish watching the football match he had downloaded that morning. Clara offered to walk him outside for some air, but he chose to stay in his chair with a small flashlight whose battery was already fading. By 8:25 p.m., Eleanor decided to head down to the street. She picked up her candle, closed the door carefully, and walked down the stairs since the lift was obviously out of service. On the second floor, a little girl was crying in the dark, afraid of the sudden silence, while her mother tried to calm her with a tight hug. Two teenagers lit the hallway with the glow of their phones, though cellular signals were beginning to weaken and some calls no longer connected. Once outside, Eleanor felt a version of Los Angeles she had never seen before. No shop lights, no blinking signs, no electric hum. Even the sound of the city was different, more open, more echoing. Some people sat on the steps of their buildings, others held candles or makeshift lanterns. The air smelled like a strange mix of candle smoke, leftover food from darkened restaurants, and faint perfume drifting from passing residents. Not far away, at the intersection of Bonnie Bray and 7th Street, a police officer named Daniel Ruiz was trying to direct stuck vehicles. He stood in the middle of the road with a long flashlight and a whistle, hoping drivers would follow his hand signals. Many were confused, some impatient, but none could do much without working traffic lights. The human voice was suddenly louder than engines. On one corner, a local street musician named Travis appeared with an acoustic guitar. He sat down on a wooden crate and began to play slow, familiar chords from songs he learned as a teenager. People stopped to listen, some filming on their phones, even though they knew their batteries were on borrowed time. Clara joined Eleanor on the curb, carrying 2 cold water bottles from a fridge that still held a bit of chill. They sat at the edge of the pavement and watched strangers start talking to each other in the dark. Across the street, Miguel was closing his grocery shop early after clearing out the last customers. He parked his old van near the entrance and kept a small dashboard light on so there would be at least a glow to see by. By 8:45 p.m., word spread quickly, passed from person to person. People said the outage covered areas around MacArthur Park, Koreatown, and parts of downtown too. Someone claimed a local radio station was still up for now, reporting a large-scale grid failure without any official explanation yet. No one could say how long it might last. Eleanor observed the faces around her. People who usually rushed past each other now looked like travelers stranded in the same place. Some shared snacks, some lent flashlights, some talked to neighbors they had never greeted before. The air was filled with a mix of caution and curiosity. 2 blocks away, an older woman named Mrs. Patel was boiling water for tea on a small portable gas stove she usually kept for picnics. Her 15-year-old son, Arun, handed out paper cups to a handful of nearby residents who gathered in the dim lobby of their building. They sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping slowly, trying to guess how long this might go on. On a 4th-floor balcony, 2 young men from London, Harry and Callum, stood with candles placed inside empty glass jars. At first they joked about how Los Angeles overdoes everything, even electricity, but the mood shifted when they saw how completely black the entire block was. Harry mentioned a blackout in England years ago, comparing it to this, although the atmosphere felt entirely different here. Around 9 p.m., the air cooled slightly, but still felt heavy. The sky, usually drowned by city lights, began to reveal more stars. Some people pointed upward in disbelief, especially children who thought such a sky only existed in countryside paintings or movies. In the distance, a dog barked and the sound of breaking glass echoed from an unseen spot. People turned their heads, but no one could locate the source. Officer Ruiz, assisted by 2 other officers, Marisol Vega and Anthony Cho, formed a temporary barrier at a larger intersection to prevent crashes. They used old traffic cones and reflective strips pulled from the trunk of a patrol car. The bus driver from earlier, Sandra Lewis, stayed with a group of passengers on the sidewalk, trying to reassure them. Joshua Clark offered to walk a few of the women home since the streets were unsettlingly dark. Eleanor and Clara decided to walk toward MacArthur Park to see what was happening there. They passed shops with half-open doors, owners clutching flashlights or makeshift lanterns. At a cafe that normally ran until midnight, the manager was packing unsellable food into paper bags and handing it out for free. He said it was better for people to eat it now than let it spoil in dead refrigerators. At the edge of the park, they saw a small cluster of unhoused residents huddled near a concrete gazebo. Usually the area was dimly lit by park lamps, but tonight only the glow of small candles stuck into the ground marked their circle. Local volunteers had arrived with food and water, walking cautiously through dark streets just to make sure no one was left hungry. Quiet conversations floated in the air, turning the park into a strange open-air gathering of secrets and survival. By 9:20 p.m., a man named Carl Henderson, who lived on the 5th floor of an old building on Vermont Avenue, brought out a battery-powered radio. He placed it on the hood of a parked car and turned up the volume. People gathered around to listen. A reporter announced that the outage had spread west and south, hitting parts of Santa Monica and West Hollywood. Early reports suggested a transmission failure on a major line, but investigation was ongoing and there was no statement from the grid authority. Clara asked Eleanor if she wanted to head back. Eleanor still wanted to see more of the city in this rare state, so they kept walking together. Near the corner of 7th and Union Avenue, they met an older couple trying to find a doctor because the wife was struggling to breathe. Pharmacies were closed, and ambulances were stuck behind dark intersections and congested roads. Clara, in her nursing training, knelt beside the woman and helped her regulate her breathing until they located a nearby emergency van that could take her in. Meanwhile, on the rooftop bar of a hotel downtown, guests who had been admiring the skyline stood frozen in the dark. A bartender named Luis tried to calm them as he handed out pocket flashlights from a supply drawer. Where glass towers once glowed in every direction, there was now a jagged silhouette of buildings fading into the horizon. A few British tourists on holiday recorded videos of the blackout view, stunned to witness Los Angeles in near silence. By 9:45, helicopters began to buzz overhead. One belonged to a local news station trying to capture aerial footage. Its spotlights swept over roofs and streets, carving sudden beams of brightness into an otherwise submerged city. The constant thrum of rotors added tension to the already uneasy night. The longer the dark persisted, the more residents scavenged for supplies. Candles, matches, power banks, bottled water, anything that might become essential. Some children sat cross-legged on sidewalks, playing low-tech games in the glow of dim phone screens. A group of international students from England, Spain, and South Korea gathered on the steps outside their dorm, discussing how a city powered by so much technology could topple so completely in a moment. At a small hospital near Beverly Boulevard, the backup generators kicked in but flickered every few minutes. Hallway lights blinked, causing alarm among patients. Nurses carried portable lamps room to room, checking vital signs and offering calm words they barely believed themselves. Doctors tried to keep the atmosphere under control, though some equipment simply could not function without steady current. In a dim bar on Venice Boulevard, a British technician named Malcolm sipped a warm drink with two other patrons. He told them about blackout experiences in Birmingham years before, how people there always kept candles and spare batteries ready in a drawer. He contrasted it with Los Angeles, where many assumed the grid would never truly fail. Their quiet laughter echoed strangely in the shadows. By the time the clock crept toward 10 p.m., a light wind rolled through the streets, carrying the scent of fallen jacaranda blossoms. The chirp of insects, usually drowned out by traffic and neon, now filled the air. Even footsteps sounded louder, each heel, sandal, or sneaker tapping against pavement like soft percussion. But beneath the surreal calm, unease lingered. No one knew if the electricity would return in a few hours or vanish until daytime. No one knew if this was a simple malfunction or a sign of something broader. Some residents began storing water in buckets, pots, or empty bottles, worried the pumps might fail next. Eleanor and Clara made their way back toward the apartment building at a slow pace, taking in every candle, every quiet voice, every silhouette moving carefully along darkened sidewalks. They passed a circle of teenagers telling improvised ghost stories. A sudden clang in the distance made them jump and laugh nervously. Nearby, a young pastor had opened the church doors and offered shelter and drinking water to anyone passing by. When they arrived at their building, they saw a few neighbors working together to hook a car battery to a string of emergency lights near the front steps. Robert Kensington sat in a folding chair, tuning his radio with a focused expression. He nodded at them as they passed and said power might not return before midnight, maybe even longer. Eleanor looked up at the sky again, strangely clearer than she had ever seen. She wondered how many chance meetings, accidents, or hidden stories were unfolding in the shadows of this powerless night before the city regained its brightness. And just as she stepped toward the entrance, a shout echoed from the far end of the street. Eleanor froze on the stairwell landing just outside the front entrance as the sound carried through the dark street. It wasn't a playful shout or someone calling a name. It was sharp, abrupt, and filled with the kind of energy that makes people instinctively react before thinking. Clara, who was a few steps behind her, nearly bumped into her back. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, though the answer was obvious. Across the street, a handful of residents turned their heads at the same time, each face touched by either candlelight, flashlight glow, or the silver wash of the moon. The sound had come from the direction of the alley that ran behind Miguel's grocery store and the old laundromat next door. A second cry followed, shorter, muffled, and cut off quickly like someone had clamped a hand over their own mouth or someone else had. Eleanor glanced at Clara. They didn't speak, but an unspoken agreement passed between them. They stepped off the building's front stoop and moved toward the edge of the sidewalk to see better. Several others who had been sitting on steps or leaning against parked cars stood up. A tall man in a denim jacket whispered something to a woman clutching a lantern. Two teenagers who'd been joking moments earlier went completely silent. Then someone started running. A silhouette burst from the dark end of the street, sprinting past a row of trash bins and shadowed parked cars. At first, it was hard to tell anything about them beyond speed. Just the rapid thud of shoes on pavement and the frantic swish of fabric. As they passed under a faint spill of moonlight, Eleanor could see they were barefoot, wearing what looked like pajama pants and an oversized t-shirt. They didn't seem to be chasing anything or being chased. They just ran. "Hey," someone called out instinctively, but the runner didn't look back. The figure kept going down Bonnie Bray Street, dodging clusters of people and cars stalled at odd angles. A few residents pressed themselves to the walls of buildings to let them through. One elderly man gasped when a runner nearly clipped his shoulder. Then, like a ripple effect, whispers began to spread. Some asked if someone was hurt. Others speculated it was a robbery or someone panicking in the dark. A woman holding a candle murmured that she'd heard something like glass shattering earlier. Officer Ruiz, who had been stationed at the intersection just south of them, moved quickly toward the noise. He signaled to Officers Vega and Cho, who were directing foot traffic around a stalled bus farther down the road. Clara placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. "Should we go check?" she asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't impulsive by nature, but something in her, maybe the same curiosity that drove her journalism years, pushed her forward before she could talk herself out of it. "Let's at least go closer," she said. "Not too close, but enough to see what's happening." They weren't the only ones drawn in that direction. About a dozen people drifted toward the alley entrance near Miguel's shop, some with phone flashlights, others with only the glow from windows above to guide them. Miguel himself stepped outside his van when he noticed the commotion. "What was that?" he asked a man passing by. "No idea," the man muttered. "Came from the back alley." Somebody screamed. From the apartment windows overlooking the street, a few silhouettes appeared, residents peering down to catch glimpses of movement. When Eleanor and Clara reached the mouth of the alley, they stopped. The darkness there seemed thicker, the kind that swallows shapes just a few feet away. A dumpster cast a heavy shadow across the narrow path, and a sagging wooden fence blocked the view beyond it. Someone near them whispered, "Should we call for help?" But another voice answered, "Phones aren't working right now." Half the calls keep dropping. A clatter of metal rattled deeper in the alley, then hushed again. Officer Ruiz arrived seconds later, flashlight drawn, but pointed downward so as not to blind anyone nearby. He spoke calmly but firmly. Everyone stepped back from the entrance. "Please give us room." Clara nudged Eleanor gently, and they retreated to the sidewalk along with the others. Ruiz beckoned Officer Vega, who jogged over from the direction of the bus. Before either could enter the alley, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed off the walls again. Lighter this time, more controlled. A figure emerged from behind the dumpster, hands raised slightly as if to show they weren't a threat. It was a teenage boy, maybe 16, with short curls and a gray hoodie. His breathing came fast, but not panicked. "I'm not hurt," he said, preemptively, voice trembling a little. I heard something." Ruiz studied him a moment. "Did you shout?" The boy shook his head. "No, it wasn't me. It came from farther in, near the back fence by the laundromat." Vega stepped forward. "Did you see anyone?" "I only saw a shadow move," the boy replied. "I thought maybe somebody fell or got jumped. I don't know." More residents gathered now, despite Ruiz asking them to stay back. The lack of light gave the moment an eerie weight. Whispers fluttered through the group like moths. Then, without warning, another sound emerged, softer but unmistakable, a whimper, like someone trying not to cry out. It came from behind the wooden fence. Vega and Ruiz exchanged a look. Vega moved first, flashlight angled carefully. Ruiz followed, one hand on his radio, even though the signal was unreliable. Clara instinctively stepped closer, and Eleanor followed without thinking. Past the dumpster, the alley opened into a sliver of space between two buildings. A recycling bin lay tipped over, and a plastic bag rustled in the breeze. As Vega approached the fence, she called out, "Is someone there? If you're hurt, we're here to help." For a moment, nothing moved. Then came a faint answer, a breathy, broken fragment of a voice. "Please." Ruiz motioned for people to stay back. Clara moved beside him. "I'm trained," she said quietly. "If someone needs help." Ruiz gave her a sharp but understanding nod. "Stay just behind us." Eleanor stayed where she was, but every sense strained forward. Vega reached the fence and found a narrow gap where a panel had come loose at the bottom. She crouched, lowered the flashlight beam, and peered through. Her posture changed immediately, alert but controlled. "I see someone." Ruiz moved to the other side, looking for an opening big enough to get through. "There's a gate around the corner," someone from the crowd said. It opens into the laundromat's back lot. Ruiz and Vega headed that way, Clara close behind. Eleanor followed to the edge of the alley, careful not to block anyone. At the corner, a chain-link gate stood partly ajar. Ruiz slipped through first, flashlight steady. Vega went next, then Clara. Beyond the fence, the narrow back lot of the laundromat was barely lit by the dim reflection of moonlight off parked cars. Shadows from broken pallets and stacked bins crawled across the ground. And near the back wall, slumped beside a pile of discarded cardboard, was a person curled slightly, holding one arm against their side. Clara knelt immediately, checking the figure with gentle hands. "It's a woman," she said. "She's conscious. Looks shaken." The woman's face was partially hidden by her hair, tangled and dusted with something like grit. She wore jeans and a dark sweater that seemed torn at the sleeve. Her breathing was uneven, and when Clara touched her shoulder, she flinched. Ruiz spoke softly. "Can you tell us your name?" The woman hesitated, then whispered something too faint to hear. Vega moved the light away from her eyes and aimed it at the ground instead. "We're not here to hurt you. You're safe for now." Clara examined the woman's arm. It wasn't bleeding, but she held it as if something ached. "I don't think it's broken," Clara said, "but she's in pain." Eleanor stood just behind the fence, watching through the opening. Her chest tightened with the same mixture of dread and curiosity she'd felt in war reporting years ago. The woman tried to speak again, a little louder. Someone tried to grab me." Clara and Vega both looked at her sharply. "Where?" Vega asked. The woman nodded toward the far end of the lot. "Back there. I fell. I screamed. Did you see who it was?" Ruiz asked. She shook her head weakly. "He ran when I screamed." Behind them, more people gathered near the alley mouth despite instructions. The news that someone had been attacked, or nearly attacked, rippled quickly. Ruiz looked up and signaled Vega to manage the crowd. He used his radio again, though the static nearly swallowed his words. Clara continued quietly assessing the woman's injuries. Eleanor stayed quiet, observing everything. The blackout had already reshaped the night in unpredictable ways, but this was different. This wasn't just inconvenience. Somewhere in the dark, someone else had moved under cover of shadow, and the night was far from over. Clara gently helped the injured woman sit up a little straighter, supporting her back with one arm. The woman's breathing was shallow, but her eyes were more focused now. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the dark end of the lot, as if expecting someone to reappear. Ruiz swept his flashlight across the back fence and the strip of asphalt that stretched behind the laundromat. There were footprints in the dust near the cardboard pile. Fresh, uneven, as if two people had stumbled. A knocked-over plastic crate lay on its side near a drain. "What's your name?" Clara asked softly. The woman swallowed before answering. "Amanda." "All right, Amanda," Clara said. "You're safe here. Can you move your arm at all?" Amanda winced but nodded. "He grabbed me from behind. I don't think he broke anything. I just hit the ground hard." Ruiz crouched nearby. "Can you describe him at all?" "Height." "Close?" "Accent." Amanda closed her eyes a moment. "I didn't see his face. He came out of nowhere. His voice, he said something. I think he was whispering, but I couldn't hear the words." Vega reappeared through the gate, keeping some distance so as not to crowd them. "We've got too many people gathering at the alley. They're nervous." Ruiz exhaled and stood. "Try to keep them back, and see if Cho can block off the entrance with cones or tape from the squad car." Vega nodded once and slipped away again. Clara helped Amanda to her feet slowly. "Can you walk if we go back through the gate?" Amanda nodded shakily. "Just don't leave me here." They guided her out of the lot, stepping carefully around debris. As they emerged into the alley, the murmur of anxious voices swelled. The crowd had doubled. Some stood on tiptoes, others craned necks to see over shoulders. One man tried to shine his phone light into the gap, earning a sharp warning from Vega to move back. Eleanor edged to the side, not wanting to block Clara's path. She watched Amanda's expression, fear mixed with lingering disbelief. It reminded Eleanor of people she'd interviewed after earthquakes and riots, eyes still trying to register what had happened to them. A middle-aged woman near the front of the crowd asked loudly, "Was she attacked? Is someone out here hurting people?" Her voice held the brittle tension of someone ready to panic. "Step back, please," Vega repeated in a firm tone. "Give her space." Clara and Ruiz led Amanda to the sidewalk in front of Miguel's grocery shop. Miguel himself came forward carrying a folded blanket from his van. "Here," he murmured, wrapping it around her shoulders. A few residents tried to ask Amanda questions, but Ruiz raised a hand. "Give her time. We'll sort this out." Eleanor moved closer to Clara, speaking quietly. "Should someone call for an ambulance?" "We can try," Clara said, glancing at her phone. "But signals are a mess, and even if one reaches a dispatcher, they might not get through fast." Amanda clutched the blanket tighter and looked around at the dim street. "He ran that way," she said, pointing shakily toward the back of the laundromat building. "I think he hopped the fence." Ruiz considered the direction. "That leads toward the service road behind the apartment blocks. Could be he lives nearby or was just hiding there." Someone in the crowd muttered, "Great. Now we've got creeps taking advantage of the blackout." From the corner, the teenager who'd found the scene earlier hovered awkwardly. He looked at Amanda with apology in his eyes, though he'd done nothing wrong. Ruiz addressed the crowd with a steady voice. "Everyone listen, please. We don't know who the suspect is or if he's still nearby. Stay in well-lit areas, stay together, and report anything suspicious immediately. Officers are patrolling, but the blackout limits what we can cover." A man in a leather jacket scoffed quietly. "What lights? The whole street's dead." Before Ruiz could respond, an older neighbor named Mrs. Farley stepped forward holding 2 tall candles in glass jars. "Stay by others," she said, her British accent unmistakable against the hum of American voices. "No wandering alone, especially down alleyways. Darkness lets all manner of trouble in." Her tone was matter of fact, not panicked, and a few people seemed to steady themselves hearing it. Amanda sat on the curb, and Clara knelt again to check her arm more closely. Miguel fetched a small first aid kit from his van, handing over bandages and antiseptic. Amanda managed a faint thank you. Eleanor crouched beside them. "Did he say anything else?" Amanda hesitated. "I thought I heard him breathe, like he was right behind me. Then I felt his hand, and when I screamed, he shoved me down. I must have hit my head a bit, too." Clara parted Amanda's hair gently. "There was a small bump, but no blood. You might have a mild concussion. We'll keep an eye on you." A soft breeze shifted the candlelight along the pavement, stirring the shadows. Conversation continued in low currents around them. Some residents drifted back toward their buildings, but many stayed nearby, uneasy. At the far end of the block, a different sound rose, a dull banging, like someone slamming a metal door repeatedly. People turned their heads. The noise came from the direction of a shutter mechanic's garage 2 streets over. Ruiz grimaced. "Vega," he called. "I hear it," she answered, already moving. Across the street, Harry and Callum, the young men from London with candles and jars, exchanged wary looks. Callum muttered, "First screams, now banging. Feels like someone's testing our nerves on purpose." Harry nodded, folding his arms. "Or multiple people using the dark for cover. Back home, there was a blackout when I was a kid. Burglaries shot up in the first hour. Nearby, an elderly Guatemalan man crossed himself quietly." Clara and Eleanor helped Amanda to her feet again and guided her toward the entrance of their building. where a small circle of neighbors had set up chairs and lanterns. Robert Kensington, still with his fading flashlight, rose to clear his seat. "I'll stay with her," Clara said. "And if anyone else comes back hurt, we can at least treat the basics here." Eleanor nodded, then glanced at Ruiz. "You're going to check the garage?" Ruiz clipped the flashlight to his belt and adjusted it. "We have to. Could be nothing. Could be connected." Officer Cho joined him, and together they headed down the street with measured strides. The group near the building watched them disappear into the deep shadow beyond the intersection. The night, which had briefly felt cautious but calm, seemed to tighten again with something heavier, an awareness that this blackout might expose more than dark streets. Clara draped the blanket more snugly around Amanda and guided her into a folding chair. Eleanor stayed at her side, arms crossed, listening to the distant echo of footsteps and metal thuds carried on a wind that was growing colder. And somewhere behind the darkened laundromat, beyond the fences and cluttered lots, something unseen shifted once more. The wind carried the faint smell of oil and metal as Ruiz and Officer Cho advanced toward the mechanic's garage. Their flashlights sent narrow cones of light across the street, catching the edges of abandoned vehicles, shuttered storefronts, and uneven pavement. Each step landed quietly, but the tension around them made every sound feel sharper. The banging continued, but not in a steady rhythm. It came in bursts, 3 knocks, then silence, then a single slam. It didn't sound like someone trying to break in. It sounded more like someone trapped or frantic. When they reached the chain-link fence at the edge of the garage lot, Ruiz pressed one hand against the metal gate. It rattled softly. The interior was too dark to make out details, and the windows of the garage were blacked out by grime and dust from years of minimal upkeep. "You hear voices?" Cho asked quietly. "Just the banging for now," Ruiz answered. "Keep your light low. We don't know if someone's hiding inside or just panicking." They slipped through a side opening where a section of the fence had been cut long ago by scavengers. As they crossed the gravel lot, the banging stopped abruptly. Back near Miguel's shop, Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the direction the officers had gone. Amanda sat hunched in the folding chair, her fingers gripping the blanket. The dim light from the lanterns cast long shadows across her face, making her look both older and strangely distant. Clara dabbed antiseptic on a scrape at Amanda's elbow. "Do you feel dizzy at all?" "A little," Amanda murmured. "Mostly I just feel like he's still out there." A boy sitting nearby with a half-melted candle asked, "Do you think he lives around here?" Amanda didn't reply. Eleanor stepped in gently. "We don't know, but you're not alone now." People had begun to cluster in small pockets along the sidewalk. Some were speaking in hushed tones, others just sitting together in silence. Without phones, TVs, or streetlights to distract them, the city felt stripped down to breath, movement, and memory. Harry and Callum crossed the street and sat on the curb near Eleanor. Callum kept glancing at the alley. "Do things like this happen often here?" "Not like this," Eleanor said, "but a blackout can turn familiar places upside down in minutes." Callum let out a slow breath. "Makes London power cuts seem civilized by comparison." Across the sidewalk, the teenager who first heard the scream paced in small, anxious circles. A woman in a headscarf asked him if he was okay, but he only nodded without meeting her eyes. Closer to the alley entrance, Miguel stood with arms folded, watching the darkness like it might blink first. Under his breath, he said something in Spanish about the night being too long already. At the far end of the block, where Ruiz and Cho had vanished, a soft clatter echoed again. This time it sounded different, less like banging and more like something falling. Ruiz approached the roll-up garage door and tested it with his hand. It was partially stuck, angled off its track. Cho shone his light along the edge, revealing a dented metal panel and fresh scrape marks. Then came a voice from inside, low, rough, and aggravated. Hey, hey, who's out there? Ruiz straightened. Los Angeles police. You all right in there? There was a pause, then heavy footsteps approached from the other side. Can't open the side door, the voice called. Lock's jammed. I've been pounding on the wall for 10 minutes. Thought nobody heard me. Cho glanced at Ruiz. Do we try the rear entrance? Let's find it, Ruiz said. They circled around the building, stepping over discarded tires and an overturned trash bin. Behind the garage was a rusted metal door with a narrow window. Ruiz tried the handle locked. His flashlight beam showed a silhouette through the glass, a stocky figure wiping sweat from his forehead. Back up from the door, Ruiz called. We'll see if we can pry it or break the lock. Inside, the man muttered something and stepped away. Cho found an iron bar lying near some old pallets and wedged it under the handle. With a firm twist, the lock snapped and the door creaked open. A tall mechanic in grease-stained coveralls stumbled out, blinking under the flashlight glare. Thank the Lord, he exhaled. Name's Derek. Generator cut off, lights died, door jammed. I was cleaning the back lot when everything went pitch dark. You alone in there? Ruiz asked. Yeah, Derek answered, rubbing the back of his neck. Just me. Shop's been closed to customers for hours. I was sorting tools when I heard something over by the alley earlier, but then the door slammed shut behind me. Cho regarded him. What did you hear in the alley? Derek frowned. Could have been someone jumping the fence. Hard to tell. You think it's connected to the scream people mentioned? We're checking every lead, Ruiz said. Derek looked uneasy. Well, you might want to see the lot behind the shop next door. People dump junk there. Easy to hide in. Ruiz radioed Vega with a quick update, though the signal sputtered. Then he turned to Derek. You're free to head home, but stay in lit areas. We're advising people not to wander. Derek nodded and grabbed a flashlight from inside before locking the garage from the outside with a spare key. I'm not sticking around here any longer tonight. Back near the apartment building, the atmosphere hadn't relaxed much. Amanda sipped water from a paper cup Miguel found in the back of his van. Her shoulders shook slightly despite the blanket. Eleanor asked gently, Did you see anyone else in the lot before he grabbed you? Amanda hesitated. I thought I saw movement behind the bins. But everything was so dark. Clara said, Once your arm stops aching and you've rested a bit, we'll check your balance and see if you need proper medical attention. Amanda gave a faint nod, lowering her gaze. Across the sidewalk, someone had lit 2 small tea-light candles on top of an overturned bucket to mark the entrance of the alley. The flickering glow made the walls look uneven and alive. A few more residents trickled outside from nearby buildings, drawn by rumor. A young couple carrying a toddler stood near the corner, the child asleep on the father's shoulder. A group of college students huddled on the steps, one of them scrolling through a news app repeatedly despite no updates. Joshua Clark, the man who had escorted the bus passengers earlier, returned from a quick patrol with a neighbor. No sign of anyone suspicious along the north side, he told Vega, who had come back from checking the crowd. But people are on edge. Vega thanked him and scanned the area. Her jaw was tight, but she hadn't lost her composure. A ripple of conversation rose near the building's entrance. Someone mentioned that in another part of the city, looting had begun where shop alarms failed to trigger. Another person said they saw 2 figures running behind a closed taco stand. Eleanor listened with an uneasy calm. She'd heard rumors spiral before, sometimes sparked in truth, sometimes in fear. But tonight, with the blackout stretching into unknown hours, every whisper found a place to settle. Amanda shifted in the folding chair, wincing as her arm throbbed. Clara crouched beside her and asked, Do you feel safe staying out here, or would you rather go inside the lobby? There are people there keeping lanterns going. Amanda glanced at the dark windows of the building. And there might be better, but I don't want to block anyone. You won't, Eleanor said. We'll make space. They helped Amanda to her feet again. As they guided her toward the entrance, a sudden hush settled across the small crowd. Half a block away, a dog began barking fiercely, the kind of bark that signals it has seen something moving where it shouldn't. Another joined in, then another, forming a chorus that cut through the night. People turned instinctively toward the sound. The dogs were somewhere behind a line of houses on the parallel street, their shadows jumping in and out of view behind gates and shrubs. A teenage girl whispered, "Do they see him?" No one answered at first. Then a dull thud echoed, followed by the clatter of something metallic rolling across asphalt. In the tremor of silence that followed, the city felt as if it were holding a breath too large to contain. The blackout had already stolen the lights. Now it was beginning to test the nerves of every soul still awake. And far off, beyond the reach of candles and flashlights, footsteps whispered again along the forgotten edges of the street. The footsteps were not loud, but they carried in a way that made the hairs at the back of the neck lift. They seemed to move along the narrow strip of pavement that divided the backs of two housing complexes, a place normally lost in the glow of alley lamps that were now nothing but cold metal poles. Eleanor turned her head slowly in that direction, not wanting to draw sudden attention to herself. Clara, helping Amanda toward the lobby doors, paused mid-step. Several people standing near the curb stiffened, their conversations fading into wary silence. Someone whispered, "Did you hear that?" And another voice answered, "It's coming from behind the old fence near the alley." The dogs that had been barking in the distance now changed their tone. Their growls rolled low and cautious, as though whatever they had sensed was no longer moving but waiting. Officer Vega was the first to react. She motioned for a few onlookers to step back from the sidewalk's edge. "Stay in groups," she said. "Nobody head down that side." Amanda flinched at another faint scuffing sound. Eleanor placed her hand gently on Amanda's uninjured arm, guiding her inside. The building's lobby smelled faintly of old carpet and wax polish, and lanterns placed on the floor sent dancing shapes across the walls. A small group of residents huddled there, some on chairs, some sitting on the floor with blankets around their shoulders. Robert Kensington had found an old battery-powered radio and was fiddling with its tuning knob. The static crackled and hummed like distant insects. He muttered something about radio waves being fickle when the power grid collapsed, then lifted the device to his ear to catch a faint station bleeding through the noise. Outside, Eleanor stood just inside the open doorway, watching the dark street. Clara helped Amanda settle on a cushioned bench near the window. The blanket still wrapped around Amanda shifted when she exhaled. Harry and Callum had wandered closer to stand just outside the entrance. Callum leaned against a pillar, trying to peer down the long stretch of road. "You think that's the same guy?" he asked quietly. Harry kept his voice low. "Could be anyone. Could be several people using the dark to move around." Near the middle of the street, Vega and Joshua were speaking in low tones. Joshua pointed toward the parallel block, where a line of trees stood like silent watchers. Vega nodded, then called out for two volunteers to help make sure no one drifted off alone in that direction. A woman named Zoe stepped forward, holding a sturdy flashlight with a cracked lens. Beside her, an older Vietnamese man named Tan offered to walk the perimeter near the alley mouth. Vega instructed them firmly not to engage with anyone suspicious, only to keep watch in pairs. Eleanor noticed the teenager who had discovered Amanda was still pacing near the lamppost. He hugged his arms to his chest and kept glancing toward the alley as if expecting the air itself to speak. From a rear lot behind Miguel's shop, a metallic clang struck out of the silence. This time closer. A trash lid? A pipe? It reverberated against the walls and then went still. Amanda covered her ears for a moment. Clara moved to the lobby doorway, her face alert. That was nearer, she said to Eleanor. Eleanor nodded slowly. Something sweeping the area, or someone. Another cluster of residents emerged from one of the apartment buildings farther down the street, guided by a lantern held high by a tall woman in a navy coat. We just heard a crash by the dumpsters behind our place, she said. Is anything happening here? Vega addressed her from the street. We're aware of movement. Keep your people together. No one walks off alone, not even for a quick check. The woman nodded and ushered her group toward the cluster of neighbors seated near the front steps of the building. A man carrying a small dog in his arms scanned the dark carefully. Eleanor noticed that the streetlights, though dead, still reflected a thin smear of moonlight on their glass covers. The sky above them was marbled with faint stars, more visible than she had seen in years. It gave the night an eerie clarity even though the ground remained blind. Ruiz and Cho returned from their search of the garage block, their footsteps purposeful and faces stern but not panicked. Ruiz spoke briefly with Vega, pointing back the way they had come and mentioning Derek. Vega's expression shifted at the mention of someone trapped but unharmed. As Ruiz turned to address the crowd loosely gathered by the sidewalk, another stirring sound rose. This time not footsteps, but a dragging scrape, like something heavy brushing along the concrete. Heads swiveled again in near unison. The sound came from a path between two residential buildings separated by a narrow iron gate. The path led toward a back courtyard filled with recycling bins and crates from shut-down convenience store. Ruiz signaled for Cho to investigate from the left while he moved from the right. Everyone stay back, he said without shouting, but his voice carried enough to hold people in place. A man in a tan coat muttered to his wife, I knew this blackout would bring prowlers. His wife murmured, don't jump to conclusions. Inside the lobby, Amanda whispered to Clara he might still be around. He knows the dark. Maybe he's hiding behind fences. Clara looked at her steadily. Whoever he is, he'll have more eyes on him now. Eleanor stayed at the doorway, not stepping out, but refusing to retreat inward. The tension that hung over the block was no longer just fear of darkness. It had become a quiet waiting, like the breath before a shout or the stillness before glass shatters. The dragging scrape stopped as abruptly as it began. Cho's flashlight beam cut a slow arc across the iron gate and the narrow path. He crouched to peer inside. Ruiz stood a few paces to the right, angled to see any shadow that might slip past. Then from behind the bins, something toppled. Cho raised his flashlight sharply. Show your hands. Step out slowly, he called. There was no immediate response. People held their breath. Even the dogs in the parallel street fell silent for a moment. A shape emerged at last, but not a man. A medium-sized dog, its fur patchy and its collar hanging by a thread, limped into the flashlight's edge. It blinked against the beam and paused, sniffing the air as though weighing whether to run. The crowd exhaled collectively, some in nervous laughter, others in lingering caution. Ruiz lowered his flashlight slightly, his posture easing but not relaxed. Where did you come from, buddy? He murmured, more to himself. The dog whined softly, then turned and slipped through a break in the fence into another yard. Harry let out a breath. False alarm. Callum rubbed his neck. Or a warning. If he got spooked, something scared him too. Zoe, still holding the Cracklin's flashlight, scanned the ground. Dogs don't knock over bins for fun, but they don't usually flee from their own mess so fast. Ruiz frowned thoughtfully. We keep watching. As some tension dissipated, The crowd thinned slightly again. A few residents returned to the stoops of their buildings. Others moved closer together on the sidewalk, talking in low, jittery voices. But no one went to sleep. Not yet. Inside, Clara checked Amanda's pupils for dilation, then guided her to breathe slowly. Amanda's shoulders eased slightly, though every outside sound pulled her gaze back to the door. Robert Kensington finally caught a weak radio signal through the static. A muffled voice was reporting that several districts remained without power, with no clear restoration timeline. There were mentions of minor altercations, some break-ins, rising calls to emergency lines, and an overwhelmed grid authority. Robert shared the information quietly with those near him. A few people muttered in resignation. One elderly woman asked if the hospitals still had generators running. Another asked about the airport. Eleanor stepped back outside. She noticed small candles flickering in random windows all up and down the block, like stars trapped in glass instead of sky. Vega approached Eleanor and Clara at the door. "We might have to organize shifts," Vega said. "Keep people in pairs to watch each end of the street. Not to confront anyone, just to see if there's movement." Clara nodded. "I can help once Amanda's stable." Eleanor said, "I could take a watch if needed." Vega gave a short nod. "Don't wander far. And if anyone sees something, call out." Loud. In the distance, more voices rose from another street. Unclear, maybe arguing, maybe calling for help. It was impossible to tell. The hour was moving deeper into night. The blackout showed no sign of lifting. The stars overhead stared down like unblinking witnesses. And somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the dumpsters and broken tracks of alley pavement, footsteps shifted once again. This time quieter, more careful, as though they had learned from the attention they'd drawn. The careful footsteps faded before anyone could pinpoint a direction. People listened anyway, as though their ears might catch the faint scrape of gravel or the brush of cloth against wood. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was stretched thin, vibrating with guesses and half-formed fears. Ruiz and Cho regrouped by the curb, their posture tense. Vega returned from checking the far end of the block, murmuring to Joshua about setting a rotation near the intersection. The lanterns and candles flickered in brief gusts of wind, making shadows lurch and dip across faces. Inside the lobby, Amanda shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Clara stayed beside her, one hand on her wrist to feel her pulse, the other tracing a line down Amanda's forearm to assess lingering pain. Eleanor remained near the door, not blocking it, but standing like a hinge between inside and outside. From somewhere down the street, a car horn beeped twice, hesitant like someone testing if it still worked. No engine followed, only the chirr of insects excited by the warm darkness. Zoe and Ton had taken up their watch near the mouth of the alley where the earlier scream had risen. They stood far enough back not to silhouette themselves against the open space. Ton listened with his head slightly angled, his breathing slow. Zoe occasionally swept her flashlight in a low arc, careful not to blind herself or startle the neighbors. A rusted shopping cart tipped over near a boarded-up photocopy shop. The crash was sudden but not forceful, more like the wind had pushed it along the uneven sidewalk. It rattled in circles before settling on its side. A few people flinched. One man cursed under his breath. No one ran. Harry glanced at Callum. "Think that was wind or someone passing?" Callum shrugged. Could have been a rat. Or a cat. Or someone nudging it while hiding. Robert Kensington, now kneeling by his radio on the lobby floor, shook his head slowly as though remembering another place, another dark night. He adjusted the antenna again, hoping the crackle might turn into a proper voice. Clara finished rewrapping a bandage around Amanda's elbow. "You're doing better," she said quietly. Try to sit back and rest. Amanda nodded, though she kept scanning the doorway. A few minutes earlier, she had asked if the man who attacked her might be watching from across the street, and Clara had answered with measured calm, promising vigilance. Eleanor stepped outside, the door swinging gently behind her. She crossed the threshold and paused on the top step, feeling the heaviness of the air. She could smell something faint like burned plastic carried from another part of the city, maybe from a transformer that had blown hours earlier. Ruiz spotted her and approached. "How is she? Stable enough?" Eleanor said, shaken but coherent. "Clara thinks she'll be physically fine." Ruiz nodded, his expression not softening but acknowledging. "Good. We'll try to get her to a clinic once we confirm which ones have power." Eleanor glanced around. Any sign of someone else lurking? He exhaled through his nose. Movement here and there. Hard to tell if it's looters, animals, or scared residents stumbling around. Before Eleanor could reply, a sudden wail rose from down the block, the kind that could have been a distressed child or a loud argument. People turned toward the sound instinctively. The cry was sharp but short, cut off before direction could be established. Vega stepped forward, scanning the buildings. Anyone recognized that voice? A few heads shook. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, speculating whether it had come from the units above the corner store or from the far side of the laundromat. Moments later, 3 silhouettes emerged from a narrower side street, illuminated briefly by a candle someone held near a window above. They were young men in their 20s, walking quickly but not quite running. One of them cradled his left arm as if hurt, while the others kept glancing behind them. Ruiz moved toward them, raising his voice enough to be heard but not threatening. "Over here. What happened?" The tallest of the 3, a man in a thin hoodie with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, answered first. "Some guys throwing stuff down near the old auto yard. One of them came at us with something like a bat. Miguel," he nodded to the injured friend, "tried to block it and got clipped." Clara, overhearing from the doorway, signaled for them to bring the injured man over. They guided Miguel, whose dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, onto a chair inside the lobby. His forearm bore a swelling bruise near the wrist. Eleanor fetched a cold bottle of water from someone's cooler to use as a makeshift compress. Miguel sucked in air when Clara pressed it gently to his arm. Ruiz questioned the 2 uninjured men outside. "How many were there?" "3 or 4, the tall one said. One had a mask, like a ski mask or something. They were going through a dumpster and snapping boards off a fence." "Did they follow you?" "I don't think so, but we didn't hang around." Ruiz exchanged a look with Vega. She called softly to Officer Cho. "We might need a second patrol closer to the auto yard." Cho nodded grimly and gathered 2 volunteers, including Harry, who took a heavy flashlight with him. Clara shot Harry a pointed look that said be careful, but he just nodded lightly in acknowledgement. The wind rose again, stirring dust along the gutters. Plastic bags fluttered like ghost shapes around tree roots. A cluster of bats darted overhead briefly, drawn by the insects blooming in the electrical void. Eleanor stepped back inside, overhearing Clara murmur to Miguel about wrist mobility. Amanda looked over from the bench, her eyes widening at the sight of another injured person. "This night is never going to end, is it?" Amanda said under her breath. Clara responded gently but firmly, "It will, but we have to stay alert until then." Outside, several neighbors began quietly moving crates, chairs, and small tables to form a kind of informal gathering spot near the front steps. They arranged lanterns in a semicircle so multiple families could sit together and keep an eye on the street. Children wrapped in blankets dozed on laps. Ruiz and Vega conferred near the edge of the steps, their silhouettes tall against the glow of a single lantern. Vega jotted notes on a small pad whenever a new incident was reported. Ruiz occasionally checked his radio for updates, though the crackle and static rarely gave him anything clear. A dull thud echoed from the direction of the auto yard, distant but audible enough to draw everyone's attention again. This time, there was a second thud, then a dragging noise. Callum, who had stepped back from the patrol group to retrieve a water jug, muttered, "They're still at it, whoever they are." A man with glasses and a leather satchel said, "Could be scavengers trying to find tools or scrap metal, or somebody planning to break into the shops." No one suggested going back inside to sleep. The night pressed on like a test with no instructions. From a second-floor balcony across the street, a woman leaned over the rail holding a candle in a jar. Her voice floated down. "They're whispering on my block. I can hear them from the stairs. They keep arguing." Ruiz asked how many. 2 or 3, maybe more. "I only hear the sibilance of them. One keeps coughing." Vega called up to her. "Stay with neighbors. Lock your doors if you can." The woman nodded and retreated inside, blowing out her candle as she went. Another hour might have passed, or maybe less. Without phones or clocks, the sense of time unspooled like thread in the dark. Conversations came and went in low bursts. Someone passed around thermoses of tea. Someone else shared crackers and canned peaches. A child cried softly as her mother hummed a lullaby. Then, from behind a row of narrow homes that bordered the unused rail yard, a new sound broke. A metallic creak, followed by a smack. It was distinct enough that no one mistook it for wind. Ruiz and Vega met eyes. Vega whispered to Joshua, and he moved quietly to gather another pair for patrol. This time, Clara insisted on walking as far as the corner to observe, assuring Eleanor and Amanda she would not go deeper into the dark. Eleanor stood again in the doorway, her hands gripping the frame. She could see the lantern light glancing off Ruiz's shoulder as he advanced with Cho. The men's shadows stretched ahead of them down the street. The creaking came again, followed by a muffled voice. It wasn't pleading or angry, but it carried tension, as though someone was struggling with something stuck. On a balcony nearby, a young man whispered to his sister, "If they're trying to pry open the old rail shed, that door's been rusted shut for decades." His sister hugged herself and said nothing. Vega positioned herself at the corner, signaling the others to move in a crescent. Their footsteps were slow, their faces taut with focus. In the lobby, Robert managed finally to tune in a more stable frequency. A broadcaster spoke rapidly about scattered unrest, sirens disabled in some zones, and police urging people to stay indoors wherever possible. No updates on restoration. Amanda rubbed her temple with trembling fingers. Miguel, his arm still wrapped with the cold bottle, stared out at the darkness beyond the door. Eleanor felt the chill in her chest deepening. The night had grown quieter overall, but each isolated noise carried the weight of possibility. An overturned bin, a slammed gate, a snapped fence post, a footfall in gravel. She glanced back down the street where Ruiz and the others crept toward the source of the metallic creaking. In the shadows beyond their lanterns, something or someone shifted again, quieter now, but undeniably present. And the blackout, thick as pitch and wide as the whole city, held its breath as if waiting to see who would move first. The air around the rail yard fence seemed to vibrate with silence after that last faint shift. Ruiz lifted his hand to signal the others to slow even more. The lantern behind them cast pale light that barely touched the rusted chain link, leaving much of the yard swallowed by shadows. Cho angled his flashlight low, sweeping the ground rather than blinding his eyes with a direct beam. Vega stayed near the corner, able to see both the patrol group and the cluster of neighbors gathered near the building entrances. She kept one hand on her radio, even though its reception was unreliable, as if the physical grip itself steadied her thinking. Eleanor leaned out just enough to spot the silhouettes of Ruiz and his team. Clara had stepped outside again, only as far as the steps, not willing to leave Amanda too long, but still wanting to witness anything unfolding. The people sitting in the improvised semicircle of lanterns fell almost completely quiet. Even the sound of someone gently stirring tea in a metal mug seemed loud. Another small clatter drifted out from behind the rail yard shed, lighter this time, like a bolt or nail hitting the concrete. Ruiz paused, his shoulders tensed, and he shifted his stance to listen. A man on the far side of the street whispered to someone next to him, "Could just be scavengers. Probably don't even know we're watching." But a woman near him added in a low voice, "Scavengers don't usually risk making noise twice in the same spot." A faint murmur floated up from the yard again, too soft to identify words, but undeniably human. Ruiz motioned for Cho to circle left while he edged right, both careful not to crunch gravel underfoot. In the lobby, Amanda pressed her fingertips to the window glass. Miguel had closed his eyes, but was not asleep, the water bottle now resting beside him. Robert turned the volume of the radio lower, straining for any national mention of unrest in their specific district, but the broadcaster had moved on to another update about grid instability. Eleanor saw Vega's head turn sharply when something flickered near a broken section of fence. A narrow figure had appeared for a moment, then ducked down again, as if startled by its own miscalculation. Clara murmured, "Do you see that?" Eleanor nodded. "By the far post." The figure moved again, quicker this time, slipping along the fence line. It was impossible to tell if it was the same person who had attacked Amanda or one of the looters from the auto yard. Whoever it was moved with a kind of hurried caution, as though they were searching for an exit that didn't exist. Ruiz must have spotted it too. He stepped forward, keeping his voice low. "Stop where you are." Hands visible. There was no compliance. The figure froze for a breath, then bolted sideways through a gap between stacked pallets and old metal drums. Cho lunged to flank the movement, nearly tripping over an abandoned crate in the dark. A gasp broke from someone watching near the stoop. Children huddled closer to their parents. The older neighbors exchanged looks of unease rather than fear. They had seen many things in blackouts past, but the unpredictability still pricked at their nerves. Vega advanced a few paces, not fast enough to join the chase, but ready to intercept if the figure turned back toward the residential buildings. Joshua moved to her side, scanning the rooftops in case another silhouette appeared. The fleeing shape knocked over something metallic, another trash bin or disused oil drum, before vanishing deeper behind the rail yard structure. Ruiz muttered something under his breath, indecipherable but frustrated. For a tense minute, only the soft hum of insects filled the street. The lanterns flickered again, and a piece of cardboard tumbled along the curb with the wind. Then another voice called from the opposite side of the rail yard fence, startling those closest. "Hey, who's there?" It wasn't from Ruiz's patrol. This was someone else entirely, maybe from the houses backing onto the yard. Ruiz turned his head toward the sound, eyes scanning. Cho kept his flashlight aimed at the gap where the figure had disappeared, but did not move any farther inside. Vega raised her voice slightly. "Who called out? Identify yourself." There was a pause, then the voice answered in a shaky tone, "Name's Bradley Winters. I live behind the yard. Something hit my back door a few minutes ago. Sounded like a crowbar." The name was not familiar to most of the neighbors gathered out front, but a few people exchanged glances of recognition. He lived in one of the older duplexes around the corner. Ruiz called back, "Stay inside if you can. We're tracking someone who ran through the lot." Bradley's voice carried a mix of worry and disbelief. I tried to scare them off by yelling. Didn't know anyone else was looking. Eleanor saw Vega tighten her jaw at that. Random warnings without coordination added risk in the dark. Clara exhaled slowly, glancing over her shoulder at Amanda and then back to the street. Somewhere farther down the block, a window slid open and someone shouted for quiet, frustrated by the echoing voices. The shout triggered additional barking from a kennel of dogs 3 houses over, their high-pitched yelps ricocheting along the silent shops. Ruiz refocused on the area behind the shed. He signaled to Cho to hold his position and turned back a short distance to consult Vega. The silhouette of the figure had vanished completely, leaving only trace sounds and a sense of intrusion hovering around the rail yard. Callum, now returning from helping set up a watch on the far side, whispered to Harry, "They keep testing the edges. They're not going straight for anything big. Not yet." Harry nodded slightly. Maybe they're waiting for confusion, waiting for people to drift off or split up. Near the semicircle of lanterns, Mrs. Farley adjusted the shawl around her shoulders and said to no one in particular, "Back in London, during the storms of '87, the power died for half the city. They prowled in the silence too. You learn to listen to the smallest scrape." A teenage boy sitting near her asked, "Did the police catch them?" Mrs. Farley just gave a thin smile. "Not all of them. Some slipped back into their own neighborhoods like nothing happened." Miguel opened his eyes again and listened to this story with a grim sense of recognition, even though it was from another country and another decade. Eleanor watched Ruiz step forward to recheck the pallets. The lantern light the group carried barely penetrated the space. They would need more people or proper lighting to comb the yard thoroughly, but neither was available. Vega addressed the crowd near the building. "We'll maintain the watch on both ends. If anyone hears movement behind your houses, call out immediately. And don't go investigating alone." People nodded, some eager to show composure, others just wanted to follow directions to keep fear from spiraling. Inside the lobby, Amanda finally leaned against the backrest, though she kept her eyes half open, as if sleep might let the man from the alley appear again in her mind. Clara stayed seated on the end of the bench, prepared to stand at the slightest sound. The wind died for a brief stretch, and in that stillness, the creak of the abandoned gate near the rail yard echoed again, slow, long, as if moved by a cautious hand rather than a gust. This time, nobody ran. They all listened, and the night, still without power, tightened its unseen grip on every alley, fence, and corner of the block. The gate's long creak tapered off like a breath being held too long. Ruiz took 2 careful steps toward the sound, his boots barely brushing the gravel. Cho angled his flashlight again, but the beam's reach faded before it touched the far edge of the fence. The pallets and metal drums beyond formed jagged silhouettes in the dark, broken only by glimpses of moonlight catching on rust. Vega motioned subtly to Joshua to stay near the corner and keep watch on the street side. She didn't want anyone circling behind them unseen. A few of the residents standing further back instinctively crouched slightly, as though lowering themselves might make them less noticeable to whoever slid that gate. Eleanor held the doorframe with one hand to balance herself as she leaned forward to listen. Clara, now seated again beside Amanda, glanced up each time a new sound rippled through the air. Amanda's fingers were clenched around the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. A sudden metallic snap, like a latch releasing, cracked through the quiet from somewhere deeper in the yard. Ruiz froze again, then turned his head toward the far boundary. Someone muttered that it might be the shed door or a loose strip of metal on its hinges. Mrs. Farley narrowed her eyes at the rail yard. "Whatever it is, it's not the wind." Another voice from the semicircle, Daniel, a shop owner with a bandana around his neck, asked in a hush, "Should we try lighting up the back with the bigger lanterns? Or is that asking for trouble?" Harry overheard and said quietly, "If you light it up and someone's hiding, you either scare them off or show them where not to go next. But maybe that's enough." Near the corner where Vegas stood, the man who'd been carrying his small dog earlier whispered, "I used to work maintenance in a place like that. There's service tunnels under some of these old yards." Vega looked sharply at him. "Tunnels. Not big ones," he clarified quickly. "Just crawl spaces for cables and drainage. Most sealed or blocked, but some might still be open if no one's covered them in years." That piece of information seemed to settle heavily on everyone within earshot. The idea that someone could move below their feet, unseen, made the darkness feel deeper than before. Ruiz and Cho continued scanning the pallets until Cho raised a hand and pointed at the ground near the fence. A faint line of disturbed dust and pebbles indicated something or someone had slid or dragged an object there recently. Ruiz squatted to inspect, but didn't touch it. Vega called out quietly to the group near the steps. "Does anyone know if the old yard office is locked from inside or outside?" Miguel, still seated with the compress on his arm, spoke up with effort. "My uncle used to work there decades ago. The back door could be open from inside, even if the outside latch was jammed, but it hasn't been used since I was a kid." Ruiz straightened and exchanged looks with Cho. They both seemed to reach the same conclusion. Whoever was out there might have slipped into the office or wedged themselves behind it. A low howl of wind stirred trash along the curb, but died quickly, leaving an aftertaste of dust in the air. Suddenly, a soft clink came from the rooftop of the laundromat. Everyone's heads snapped upward. The building's flat roof was barely visible, edged with vents and the skeletal remains of an old sign. Something had shifted up there, a shoe, a loose tile, a body crossing to a better vantage point. Clara rose halfway from her seat, then forced herself to sit again for Amanda's sake. Eleanor scanned the rooftop, but saw only darkness. A resident across the street with sharper eyes muttered, "I saw a shape, just for a blink. Could have been a bird, but it was too steady." Ruiz and Cho backed away from the rail yard, needing a better angle on the laundromat roof. Vega signaled them silently and began shifting the patrol pattern, so someone always had an eye upward while others watched ground level. The neighbors reacted in hushed movements. Some stood from their seats by the lanterns but stayed close together. Others quietly ushered children closer to the lobby or urged them to sit behind adults where they felt less exposed. Amanda murmured to Clara, "What if there's more than one? What if they're spreading out?" Clara didn't lie. "It's possible. That's why we're staying visible and together." Robert Kensington, still at the radio, glanced up as if the sound above had cut through the static. He fiddled with the dial again, landing briefly on a news fragment mentioning break-ins near a freeway exit 2 miles away. He wondered if that was connected or just another trouble spot born of darkness. A pair of residents who had gone a short distance to check on an elderly neighbor hurried back toward the main group. They whispered breathlessly that they had seen a man crouched behind a parked pickup down the block, near a shop with boarded windows. They couldn't see what he was doing, but he stood and disappeared as soon as he realized they spotted him. Vega's expression hardened. She addressed Ruiz in a low tone. "We can't chase shadows all night with just 3 officers. This could burn people out and leave gaps." Ruiz nodded. "We hold the line and watch entrances. No pursuit beyond sight." That seemed to settle the immediate plan. They would not fan out and risk thinning their numbers. Instead, they would guard the fronts and sides of the block, listen, and wait for clearer signs. Back near the lantern circle, Callum and Harry began quietly moving a couple of heavy planters closer to a gap between 2 buildings, creating a choke point. A few others helped, not to barricade entirely, but to funnel any approach into a more visible path. Ton and Zoe returned from their earlier post, and reported seeing no one else in the alley behind the dumpsters, though they heard a door slam from an unknown location. The sky had shifted from pitch to a faint navy hue, still hours from dawn, but hinting at time passing. The stars thinned behind a gauze of haze, and the moon had dipped low behind the sprawl of rooftops. Eleanor noticed how exhaustion had crept into people's posture. Shoulders sagged, voices softened to avoid cracking, hands rubbed, eyes more frequently. But no one dared sleep. They all understood instinctively that to close their eyes too long might invite something worse than fatigue. Amanda asked quietly if there was any word on the power returning. Clara said no, not yet, and Amanda nodded as though she had expected that answer all along. A soft thud from a rooftop vent startled a few watchers again. They peered upward, but saw nothing move this time. The sense of being observed rather than merely hearing intruders had begun to spread, unspoken but felt. Down the street, a light flickered just for half a second. Someone shouted, "Was that a bulb? Did something come on?" But it was only a battery lantern in a window guttering before being steadied by the person who held it. A man near the entrance muttered bitterly, "Feels like the night's playing with us, not just criminals." Mrs. Farley replied in a low, knowing voice, "The night doesn't play. People do." At that exact moment, from behind the far corner of the rail yard lot, a voice rang out, clear, startled, angry, or afraid. It was impossible to tell. "Get away from there." Every head turned sharply in unison. Ruiz, Vega, and Cho snapped toward the sound. But the voice had already vanished into silence, as if the darkness swallowed the speaker whole. And no one yet knew whether that warning had come from a desperate neighbor or from one of the intruders themselves. For a long second, no one moved. The silence that followed the shout felt oddly hollow, as if the night itself had paused to listen. Ruiz raised his hand again, signaling to everyone nearby to hold their position. Cho angled his flashlight toward the corner of the rail yard fence, but the beam dissolved into the dark before it revealed anything. Joshua stepped cautiously closer to Vega, his eyes flicking between the rooftops and the street. He asked in a low voice whether they should call out again, but Vega shook her head. If that was a neighbor, they might speak twice. If it wasn't, shouting gives away our positions. The people around the lantern circle inhaled so quietly it was almost comical. Even a cough or a shuffle of shoes sounded dangerous. A few children stirred, confused by the tension and the whispering, unsure if they were supposed to hide their faces or keep watching. From the direction of the laundromat roof came a tiny clink, the sound of something lightly tapping metal. It could have been a stray cat or someone shifting their weight. Harry squinted upward, but saw nothing except the faint outline of the vent housing and a tangle of old antenna wires. Eleanor stepped outside the doorway again, scanning the opposite rooftops. She noticed her own pulse had quickened, though she barely moved. Clara stood just behind her, watching the alley between two buildings that led to the back of the rail yard. Amanda, still wrapped in her blanket, whispered to Miguel across the lobby. Was that the same voice? The man from before? Miguel listened for a moment, but didn't answer. His arm had swollen slightly, though the cold compress had helped. Ruiz and Cho exchanged glances. For a heartbeat, Ruiz considered advancing deeper into the yard to identify where the voice had come from. But the memory of the fleeing figure, the rooftop movement, and the injured strangers from the auto yard reminded him that searching blindly would only break their fragile line of defense. So instead, he stepped back and projected his voice just enough to be heard by everyone near the street. Stay alert. Nobody goes in alone. If you see or hear anyone, speak so we can all hear it. That instruction calmed some, but not all. A man near the semicircle, shoulders draped with two coats, muttered they could already be inside one of the old sheds or tunnels. His wife pressed a hand to his arm. Then let them hide there. They'll get bored and move on. But Mrs. Farley shook her head gently. They're testing the edges. They want to see how we react. They're not just passing through. Zoe crouched at the spot where she'd seen the earlier figure slip behind the fence, touching the ground with her fingertips. The dirt was smeared and loose, indicating recent movement. She stood again and walked back to Ton, who watched with narrowed eyes. Minutes dragged without a clear sound. Someone lit another candle near the steps, and its flames swayed with a light breeze. A child asked in a small voice if morning would make everything safe again. No one dared promise it. A distant siren began to wail from somewhere beyond their neighborhood, then cut off abruptly. It didn't sound like police or ambulance, more like a car alarm or industrial horn that had malfunctioned and died. In the half-light of the lanterns, the neighbors looked older and wearier than they had an hour earlier. But exhaustion hadn't weakened their alertness. It had sharpened it into something tense and quiet. Then, from the southern end of the block, where a row of single-story shops met a dead-end alley, a new sound emerged. Not footsteps this time, but a brittle crack. Something wooden had snapped under pressure. Harry and Callum both turned their heads sharply that way. Vega immediately directed Joshua to shift their watch to cover that angle. Ruiz moved a few paces, scanning between parked cars and boarded windows. The crack sounded again, clearer now. It was followed by a muffled grunt, as if someone had tried and failed to lift or break something fully. Clara placed a hand on Eleanor's arm and whispered, "Is that the old back door to Mr. Haven's antique shop?" Eleanor listened. Could be, or the fence behind it. A couple who lived in the upstairs flat above the antique shop came down to the doorway of their building, clutching lanterns. They said they'd heard scraping at the sidewall half an hour earlier, but thought it was just stray animals. Vega told them to stay close and keep an eye on the windows. Then she gestured to Ruiz and showed to hold position, but be ready. From the alley near the shop came a low thud, then the unmistakable rattle of hinges shaking in an old frame. Someone or something was testing the door, seeing if it would give. Eleanor's voice was steady when she spoke, but the tension beneath it was obvious. If that door opens, they could come through the shop and onto the main street. Ruiz knew it too, but if he and the others rushed in blindly and left the rail yard unwatched, they'd create another gap. He glanced at Vega, who seemed to reach the same conclusion. They needed more eyes, not more weapons. Harry stepped slightly forward. "I can circle to the far side, come up behind that alley." Vega shook her head. "Not alone. Take someone with you. And don't get cornered." Callum volunteered without hesitation. Ruiz handed them a spare flashlight and told them to stay in sight when they could and signal back if they spotted anything definitive. As Harry and Callum moved off along the street in low strides, the neighbors adjusted their positions again, instinctively covering the spaces left behind. Clara kept a constant watch on Amanda while still listening for every sound outside. Another rattling came from the antique shop side door, followed by what sounded like a frustrated whisper. Someone out there was becoming impatient. Eleanor stepped fully outside now, drawn by the need to see. The street felt both infinitely long and dangerously close, every shadow layered over the next like trapdoors. A slight scraping came from above again, somewhere on a roof, but no one could tell which. Joshua turned slowly, scanning with his lantern held high. Ruiz fixed his gaze on the alley near the shops, waiting for Harry's signal or for another sound that would confirm how many intruders were there. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, then 30 crept by, and the only sound were shifting feet, uneasy breathing, and the faint sway of wires overhead. Then a high, sharp clang, metal on metal, rang out from the roof of the antique shop, followed by the slam of a rooftop hatch or skylight door. Before anyone could react, Something small and metallic rolled off the roof and struck the pavement near a parked van with a hollow ping. Everyone flinched. Amanda covered her ears. Miguel sat up straighter, startled into alertness again. The object on the pavement settled with a clatter. In a lantern glow, someone spotted the shape. A tool or piece of hardware dropped from above. Ruiz couldn't see it clearly enough to identify, but the fact it had fallen from the roof was all anyone needed to know. Someone was up there. Vega stiffened, searching the roofline with narrowed eyes. Joshua raised the lantern higher, but the light couldn't reach the edge where the intruder must have stood. From the far end of the alley, faint voices rose, Harry and Callum speaking low, then stopping abruptly, as though they had spotted something. Not a single person on the block dared speak above a whisper now. The blackout had shifted from nuisance to battlefield silence, where the wrong move could tip the balance. Amanda whispered to Eleanor, almost inaudible, "He's not alone." And for the first time that night, no one tried to deny it. No one dared to move first. The tension seemed to press the air down onto their shoulders, making every breath feel too loud. The lanterns, the candles, even the dim glow from the radios inside the lobby all seemed suddenly inadequate against the expanse of black above them. Ruiz adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on the edge of the antique shop's roofline. Joshua held his lantern a little higher, though the light barely scraped the brick and tar. Somewhere near the alley, Harry and Callum's silhouettes appeared faintly against a dim spill of light from a distant window. They were frozen, listening, as if any step now would announce their position. A gust of wind stirred something loose on the laundromat's roof, creating a hollow flap that made more than one person tense again. The metallic tool that had fallen still lay near the van's tire. No one approached it. Eleanor took another step forward, inching just past the threshold of the apartment lobby. She peered upward at the roofs in both directions, the way someone might look for a stray cat. Except this time the stakes felt immeasurably higher. Clara glanced briefly toward Amanda, who had lowered her blanket enough for her eyes to be visible. The girl's expression was taut, but she seemed determined not to shrink any further. Miguel watched the street with a frown of concentration, even though his arm throbbed. Mrs. Farley folded her arms, shifting her weight with the deliberation of someone who had seen too many emergencies to panic easily. "If they've got the roof," she murmured under her breath. "They're not here just for a quick burglary." Ton noticed movement near the rail yard gate, a shape slipping from behind a stack of pallets into deeper darkness. It was quick, subtle, and gone before he could call it out. Still, his eyes stayed fixed on the spot, willing it to resolve into something definite. Ruiz finally spoke, quietly, not looking away from the rooftops. "If any of you hear feet above you, move toward the center of the street and stay in sight." He didn't bark the order. He said it like someone outlining a rule of physics. Vega added, just as softly, "No one chases a shadow into a building alone, even if they make noise. They want us to split." Some of the residents exchanged uneasy looks. The idea that the intruders might be deliberately coordinating across rooftops, alleys, and fences was something that a few had suspected but hadn't voiced yet. Harry and Callum gave a small signal, barely a tilt of the flashlight beam, that they were circling the back corner of the shop. They moved like people crossing ice, step by careful step. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the windows above the antique shop. The upstairs tenants had retreated inside again, glancing nervously through curtains. One of them cracked the window open just a sliver. They whispered something about hearing dragging sounds on the roof half an hour earlier, but dismissing it. Suddenly, a new noise drew everyone's attention, not from the rail yard or the alley or the rooftops, but from the opposite block beyond a row of parked cars. It sounded like a vehicle door being closed slowly, then another soft clink as if someone set something on the ground. Joshua pivoted that way, lantern raised, but the source was obscured by a line of small trees whose branches cast spider-like shadows on the pavement. Clara scanned the area behind the van, near where the tool lay. For a moment she thought she saw a silhouette crouched low, but then it merged with the darkness. Her mind replayed the sound of that falling object. Was it dropped unintentionally or placed there as a distraction? Eleanor whispered, "Joshua, watch the right side near the phone booth ruins." Joshua nodded, repositioning slightly. His beam skimmed across the crumbling structure where the payphones had once stood, then along the curb, then upward again. Another sound, this time from the roof of the small convenience shop near the intersection. A slow scrape, like the edge of shoes sliding on gravel-covered tar. It stopped almost immediately, but the impression remained. At least one of them was moving along the connected rooftops, testing vantage points. "I don't think they're trying to break in right now," Clara said quietly, almost to herself. "They're mapping us, figuring out who's awake, where we're looking, how many are here." Amanda shifted uncomfortably. Miguel's jaw tightened. Mrs. Farley's eyes narrowed with grim recognition. It was not a theft of opportunity across random shops. It was reconnaissance. Ruiz heard Clara's words, but said nothing. He scanned each rooftop again, memory and instinct measuring possible routes. He'd once taken a training course that covered rooftop pursuit, but that had been years ago, in daylight, with backup and radios, not with neighbors and kids at his side in a blackout. Then came a faint set of footfalls, rapid, then halted, along the roof of the laundromat. Something soft slid across gravel, and then silence again. Joshua caught the motion just as it ended, light skimming an outline that vanished behind a vent. A neighbor with a camera phone tried to lift it and record, but the screen's tiny glow wrist giving away their positions. Vega motioned for him to lower it, and he obeyed reluctantly. Clara stood alert, heart pounding but focus sharp. Eleanor remained a step ahead, arms tense, eyes tracking every scrap of movement. From the alley where Harry and Callum had gone, there was a faint whistle, two quick, separated notes. The makeshift signal they'd agreed on earlier. They'd seen something. Ruiz turned toward the alley, body rigid but controlled. Vega whispered a warning to the residents not to run or move in a group that might block the officer's path. A murmur ran through the watchers as they tried to see. Some shifted lanterns slightly to get a better angle, but the light only deepened the shadows across the brick and asphalt. Another sliver of sound, like fabric brushing wood, came from the fence line near the rail yard. Tom glanced there again, catching a flicker of movement. It could have been the same figure as before, circling to the other side. Mrs. Farley exhaled slowly. "They're trying all the edges. Left, right, above, behind." Eleanor said quietly, "They're looking for the unguarded crack." Clara's thoughts jumped to the basement access points in a few of the buildings. The old boiler rooms, the laundry rooms with back exits, the storm grates near the curb that led to short utility passages. Nothing was entirely sealed in places built decades ago. From beyond the row of parked cars came a new low series of thumps, like someone dropping something heavy but patted onto the ground. Vega motioned silently to two residents to keep an eye in that direction. Then came a sound no one wanted to hear, a click from behind the group near the opposite sidewalk. It was small, but it had weight, a door latch or a piece of metal sliding into place. Joshua turned halfway, scanning behind them. Nothing obvious moved, but a set of trash bins at the corner had shifted an inch from where they'd been earlier. Someone might have bumped them, trying to stay low. Miguel, still cradling his injured arm, murmured something in Spanish under his breath, a short prayer or curse. Amanda looked at him, but said nothing. Clara stepped slightly closer to Eleanor, both feeling the need to remain anchored in the same spot, even as the danger crept around them like smoke. Ruiz finally gave a coordinated tap of his flashlight against his leg, an agreed token to signal he was about to move a short distance. He approached the middle of the street so he could address multiple angles at once. His voice remained low but firm as he spoke toward the residents and the unseen watchers alike. "We know you're there. If you're hurt or if you need help, say it now. If you're looking for trouble, this block won't give it easy." No answer came, only the hush of wind and the creak of a sign swaying on rusted bolts. Cho moved a few steps to Ruiz's left, scanning the ground for any new tool, object, or trace. Vega kept her flashlight angled upward, eyes flicking between rooftops. Eleanor surveyed every second-floor window, every small balcony, and each roof edge that might reveal a crouched figure. But the silhouettes were flat and betraying nothing. Then, unexpectedly, a voice did respond, but not from where Ruiz had addressed. It came from higher up, faintly distorted, possibly by a mask or scarf. "You shouldn't stay out here." It was neither a taunt nor a plea. It sounded almost like a statement of fact, delivered calmly, as though the speaker knew something they didn't. The source was hard to pinpoint. The words floated between the roof of the antique shop and the corner where the laundromat met the alley. The lantern light failed to reveal a figure, but the cadence was deliberate. The neighbor stiffened like wire pulled tight. Vega glanced at Ruiz. He didn't reply immediately. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the speech itself. After a beat, Vega called back evenly. "We're not going anywhere. If you have something to say, show yourself." There was a pause, then a sound, a scrape on the roof, slow, almost casual. The same voice spoke again, slightly closer now, but still invisible. "It's almost time." Those words sent a cold ripple through every person listening. Almost time for what? An attack? Reinforcements? A signal? Joshua raised his lantern another inch. Clara and Eleanor locked eyes briefly, each recognizing the flicker of dread in the other. Then a different voice, this one from ground level near the far side of the rail yard, called out sharply, whether to the rooftop speaker or to someone else was unclear. "They're not the target. Wait." This new voice was tense, urgent. The words echoed off metal and fence posts, making it difficult to locate. For a moment, the block seemed divided by ghosts in two directions, the roof above and the darkness behind the pallets. In the lobby, Amanda's breath quickened. Miguel turned his head sharply toward the rail yard. Mrs. Farley straightened a fraction, as though bracing for a door to be kicked in. Ruiz felt adrenaline surge, but he held firm. He whispered to Vega, "Two or more," arguing. Vega nodded subtly, eyes never leaving the roofline. Harry and Callum, still near the alley corner, froze again. They heard the same voices, the same split intentions. They exchanged a glance that said they might be facing a group, not a lone trespasser. Clara's heartbeat was a sudden drum in her ears. Eleanor swallowed hard, waiting for the next word, the next misstep. But neither voice spoke again. Instead, the rooftops and alleys returned to their watchful stillness, as if the confrontation had pulled back like a wave preparing to strike with more precision. The group held their breath, not knowing whether the night had just warned them or promised them something worse. And high above, in the shadow of an old ventilation duct, a figure crouched with unblinking patience, waiting for the moment when silence broke on its own. The figure on the roof did not shift, did not make a sound, but several people below felt the weight of its presence as clearly as if it stood beside them. The night pressed inward, thick enough that even a whisper seemed like it would stick to the air before reaching anyone's ears. Ruiz kept his gaze upward, but his peripheral vision swept the street, the fence line, and the alley where Harry and Callum held their tense position. Vega scanned the rooftops in slow arcs, her breathing controlled and deliberate. Neither of them spoke, knowing words could spark motion on the other side. Clara felt the muscles in her neck tighten. Her instincts told her that nobody perched silently above a group like this unless they were waiting on someone else's cue. Eleanor studied the shadows under the ventilation duct, straining to separate roof equipment from possible silhouettes. Joshua lowered his lantern slightly to avoid making himself an easy target, but he remained alert, eyes darting between roof edges and the dark beyond the parked cars. The lantern's glow flickered gently, catching bits of broken glass on the sidewalk and small scraps of newsprint that trembled in the breeze. The windows of the apartments above were mostly dark now, though a few curtains fluttered with quiet movement as unseen faces watched. Inside the lobby, Amanda shifted to the edge of her seat, hugging the blanket to her chest. Miguel clenched his jaw, listening not only for the threat outside, but for any sound in the stairwell behind him. Another minute passed, then another. The stillness became so complete that the memory of those voices began to feel like something imagined, until a faint scrape echoed from the rail yard's far wall. It was the kind of sound a boot might make sliding across gravel, or with someone bracing themselves before climbing down. Ton narrowed his eyes. He stood only a few paces from the fence and could make out the jagged outline of pallets and drums beyond, but nothing moved. He kept replaying in his mind the phrase he thought he heard, not the target. Who were they referring to? Mrs. Farley glanced back at a group of younger residents standing closer to the building's entrance. "Stay alert," she murmured, the words more like a reminder than an order. "They're not gone." From the corner near the antique shop, Harry and Callum reappeared just enough to signal they were still in position. Their silhouettes were tense, shoulders angled toward the alley, as if expecting something to surge out from it. Then came a sound from far down the street, almost too faint to notice at first. A rhythmic thumping or distant tread, muted by distance and obstructed by buildings. Some thought it might be footsteps, others thought it might be rolling tires. Joshua caught it first and angled his head to listen. Ruiz followed his gaze, listening carefully. The sound grew a little clearer, not necessarily closer, but more distinct, like something traveling along the pavement several blocks away. It faded, then resurfaced, never loud enough to identify, but too regular to ignore. Clara's mind conjured possibilities, someone moving equipment, a group walking in deliberate steps, or was something being dragged along asphalt. Eleanor considered that it might not be connected at all, but the timing felt too exact to dismiss. Suddenly, a brittle crack came from the roof of the laundromat. Not the soft scrape from before, but something snapping, wood or metal under pressure. Vega raised her flashlight instinctively, and several lanterns turned partway in that direction. No figure was visible, only the suggestion of movement behind a small ventilation pipe, barely outlined against the night. Ruiz took one step forward into the street, positioning himself where he could pivot quickly to face either the roof or the alley. His boots crunched faintly on bits of grit and broken glass. Someone near the semicircle gasped quietly as another noise followed, this time from the opposite side of the block, a dull thud, as if something had been dropped or someone had hopped down from a ledge. Eleanor looked toward the old convenience shop. Clara scanned the rooftops over the laundromat. Joshua turned back toward the rail yard fence. It was as though every direction demanded attention at once. A hush settled deeper, and in it a whisper emerged, soft, nearly indistinguishable, but enough to make 3 or 4 heads turn. It was not English, at least not clearly, more like a low murmur between two voices. The sound came from behind the pallets near the rail yard. Ton strained to pick out the syllables, but they died as quickly as they came. In the distance, a dog began to bark, once then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed made the hair on more than one neck stand on end. Mrs. Farley muttered quietly, "They're losing patience, or they're waiting for something else to begin." Joshua could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The lantern's glow wobbled slightly as his arm tensed. He adjusted his stance to ease the ache, then held steady again. Behind them, in the building lobby, Miguel turned to check the stairwell a second time. Amanda stared at the door, convinced someone might slip in from the back when all eyes were outside. Ruiz finally spoke in a low, even tone meant for both his allies and possibly whoever lurked in the dark. "You're not scaring us off. If you've got something to say it where we can see you. If you're planning something, know that we're ready." There was no answer, but half a minute later, from the roof near the ventilation duct, a quick tapping sound emerged. 3 sharp clicks in succession, then silence again. It was not random. It had rhythm, like a signal. Vega angled her head, recognizing a pattern even if she couldn't interpret it. Clara and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Neither liked the precision behind those clicks. Then, from the rail yard's other side, near the gap in the fence where Miguel's attackers had once fled, came another sequence. 2 clicks, a pause, and a third, softer one. It was as though 2 different points were speaking in code across the rooftops and the yard. Amanda's breathing quickened. Miguel rose gingerly to his feet despite his arm, unwilling to stay seated while strange signals passed overhead. Harry and Callum froze mid-step in the alley. They could not see the roof or the rail yard fence from their vantage, but the clicks reached them faintly. They exchanged grim looks, unsure whether to move or hold. Ruiz straightened, the lines in his face hardening. Vega's hand shifted closer to her belt, not to draw a weapon yet, but to be ready if the next sound forced her hand. Ton glanced back at the other neighbors. "They're coordinating. We can't pretend it's coincidence." Mrs. Farley nodded slowly. "And they're not rushing. They want us to know we're surrounded." Eleanor took in a slow breath, the air dry and cool. She remembered the voice that said it was almost time, and the other that said to wait, that they were not the target. The words clung to her thoughts. Clara focused on the rooftops, trying to imagine how many people it would take to cover these angles. 2, 3, more? How long had they been moving across beams and scaffolds, learning the layout before the blackout even happened? And then, out of nowhere, a new sound crackled from Robert Kensington's old radio in the lobby. A burst of static slammed through the quiet, followed by a distorted fragment of speech, a frequency test, or interference from a distant broadcast. The noise startled more than a few. Eleanor turned sharply, and Amanda nearly dropped her blanket. The radio sputtered, then cut to dead air. Robert fiddled with the dial, face tense with hope that a police update or emergency signal might break through. Nothing came. The momentary distraction passed, and all eyes returned to the roofs and shadows. A distant metallic creak drifted down from the rooftop again, as though a grate or hatch had been nudged. No figure stepped into view, but the sense of being watched intensified until the silence felt almost physical. Joshua exhaled slowly and muttered, "They're waiting for something, or someone else." Ruiz didn't disagree. He slowly turned his head to scan the horizon beyond the block. What little of it could be seen beneath the blackout sky, even without lights. The faint outline of distant buildings marked the boundary where the unknown could gather. Vega stepped closer to the middle of the street, angled toward the laundromat and rail yard both. "Nobody breaks off alone," she said in a low tone for the residents. "If anything hits fast, move toward the lanterns, not away. They want us scattered." The lanterns flickered in the draft. their flames bending slightly before recovering. The circle of people around them had tightened on its own, bodies unconsciously drawing closer. A sudden clang rang out from the metal door at the back of a hardware store 3 buildings down. It lasted only a second, but the impact was heavy, like someone testing whether the door would hold against a kick. Ruiz's head snapped in that direction, but he did not leave his spot. The sound was too far from the rooftops to be the same intruders, unless they had help at ground level. Clara felt the hairs rise on her arms. Eleanor locked eyes with Joshua, both acknowledging without words that the threat was no longer confined to a single point. Mrs. Farley's voice tightened slightly. They're checking entrances. Roof, alley back doors. They want the weakest spot. From the roof, the silent figure remained perched in the shadows behind the vent housing, still motionless, still watching. And somewhere beyond the fence, in the gloom near the pallets and sheds, a second shape had begun to move with careful intent, its footsteps absorbed by the thick night. None of the neighbors could tell which direction the first strike would come from, but every one of them understood now that waiting was no longer a choice. It was the only move left before whatever had been whispered about finally began, and the blackout, deep and endless above their heads, showed no sign of lifting. The silence deepened until it felt layered, as if the darkness itself were stacked in sheets above their heads. Every small sound became amplified in the mind. Fabric shifting against a coat sleeve, the faint rattle of a loose street sign chain, the brittle crunch of grit under someone's boot when they shifted weight. Ruiz kept his posture rigid at the center of the street, but tension crept through the set of his shoulders. Vega, only a few steps off, stood angled to keep both the laundromat roof and the rail yard in view. Joshua remained a little behind them, his lantern held lower now to avoid casting them in stark relief. Near the steps of the apartment lobby, Eleanor's eyes combed the edges of the rooftops once more, pausing at every vent, chimney, and antenna stump that could hide someone crouching. Clara stood close enough to feel the faint brush of Eleanor's sleeve against her own arm, but neither spoke. From the alley where Harry and Callum waited, a soft metallic grind floated out, barely noticeable unless one was listening for the wrong thing. They stiffened at once. The noise hadn't come from anything they touched. It came from a point farther back, where darkness swallowed the thin path between walls. Callum shifted his flashlight just a hair, but didn't turn it on. Harry made a subtle gesture for silence, and they both crouched lower, listening. Somewhere above them, a faint succession of footfalls moved across a metal surface, followed by the scrape of something being dragged only a few inches. Farther up the block, a group of neighbors had unconsciously drawn together into a looser cluster, some of them holding lanterns slightly aloft while others angled mirrors salvaged from their cars to reflect any chance sliver of light upward. The reflections distorted and danced along brick facades, showing ghost movements of nothing and maybe something. Mrs. Farley quietly directed 2 younger men to stand near the curb by the trash bins that had shifted earlier. They obeyed, though neither liked being that close to the shadows behind the overturned containers. One of them glanced more than once at the manhole cover a few feet away. In the lobby, Amanda huddled near the doorframe, her breathing steadier now, but her fingers still clenched on the edge of the blanket. Miguel had moved to stand near the interior hall, one eye on the street and the other on the stairwell behind him. He kept picturing that voice in the alley. They're not the target. Wait. Wondering if these intruders confused this block for another, or if something even worse was coming that none of them had imagined. Then, from the roof of the laundromat, the first clear footfall in several minutes resonated like a hush cracked open. A soft dislodging of gravel skittered down the slope of the tar. Before anyone could pinpoint the source, another faint step followed, this time nearer the building's far edge, out of sight from where most of the residents stood. Joshua raised the lantern slightly, his expression tightening. Clara braced herself, expecting a silhouette to lean over the ledge, but none appeared. Vega's flashlight darted across the top corner and back down. A sudden, curt whistle cut through the air from the rail yard. It was short, not even a full note, as though someone had pressed lips to teeth then changed their mind. Ruiz swung his attention that way, catching a flicker of motion near the gap between two stacks of drums. Ton saw it too, a shape briefly outlined when someone further down the street turned a lantern just a fraction. It ducked behind a large crate or pallet wall before the moment could resolve into anything else. Eleanor's breath hitched, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what everyone had long suspected. There were at least two of them out here, possibly more, communicating across rooftops and ground in terse fragments. Clara's thoughts stitched themselves into shaky conclusions. If they truly believed this block wasn't the target, why remain? Why coordinate? Why risk being seen at all? From the far edge of the antique shop roof, the same voice as before spoke again. Low, nearly lost in the breath of night, but audible enough to send prickles across every listener's skin. Almost done. The phrase was too calm, too certain. Vega pressed her lips together. Ruiz didn't answer this time. He only listened, waiting for a clue that would betray how many were on the roof and where they might move next. Then, unexpectedly from the opposite direction of the rail yard, down the long, dark seam of street leading toward the freeway, a new echo rose, like something heavy shifting in an abandoned loading dock or a far-off gate swinging open. Joshua pivoted that way with his lantern. Some of the residents farther back turned to listen, and the ripple of their movement stirred old newspapers along the curb. Clara whispered to Eleanor, "They're not closing in from just one side." Eleanor nodded slowly. "They're framing us." A brief scrape from the laundromat again, then stillness. Another thud near the fence, then quiet. The kind of silent choreography that made everyone feel as though lines were being drawn they could not see. From the alley, Harry finally gave a subtle signal. One quick flash of the flashlight angled at the ground, then darkness again. It meant they'd seen at least one figure slipping away, deeper down the passage rather than toward the street. Callum, crouched beside him, heard a faint set of footsteps climbing something. Maybe a dumpster, maybe an exterior ladder concealed behind a rusted pipe. But he could not see enough to confirm. Mrs. Farley noticed a woman in the semicircle, trembling. She moved closer, making no attempt to soothe with words. Just standing near her was enough to steady the woman's breathing. Two children huddled behind their father's legs near the lobby entrance. He kept one arm out protectively, the other hand clenching a kitchen utensil he'd taken from his apartment, unsure if it could help or not. Miguel leaned halfway out the lobby door to listen, ignoring any pain in his arm. Amanda watched him anxiously, afraid he might collapse again, but he remained steady. Ton spoke quietly to the pair standing near the trash bins. "If anything comes from behind you, stay in the open. Don't run into the dark." They nodded, though one of them kept glancing sideways, unnerved by the idea of a figure emerging from a manhole. A light puff of wind rattled a sign's metal bracket, scraping rust flakes into the street. The smell of burned-out fuses and hot wiring still lingered faintly in the air, remnants of earlier surges when the power first died. The night sky remained starless where thin clouds smudged the heavens. Somewhere distant, a generator coughed to life, then died. Its momentary growl vanished almost instantly, and their area remained in blackout. Ruiz turned his head upward slightly without fully shifting his stance. "You think we're surrounded?" he asked Vega under his breath. I think they're waiting on something that has nothing to do with us, she answered just as quietly. But we're in the way. Before Ruiz could reply, another whisper drifted from the rooftop, but this time it didn't sound like the same voice. It was rougher, edged with annoyance or impatience. Hurry, just that single word, impossible to locate precisely, but it carried the kind of tension that suggested an internal argument. Clara caught it. Eleanor did too. Mrs. Farley glanced up and then down at the fence line, understanding that whatever these intruders wanted, they were on a clock. Joshua felt the lantern's handle damp in his palm. He shifted his grip and exhaled slowly, focusing on each rooftop edge in turn. A cluster of 4 neighbors near the old newsstand stepped closer to the main group, unwilling to remain in a side pocket of visibility. They whispered among themselves about retreating to the lobby altogether, though no one moved inside just yet. Then the first completely new sound in what felt like hours appeared. Footsteps, unmistakable, running along the pavement 2 blocks away. Not approaching, but moving parallel, as though someone were traversing the perimeter of the neighborhood. Everyone heard it. Heads turned. Lantern beams twitched. The running steps tapered off as if the runner had slowed to a walk or ducked into a recess. Eleanor felt her stomach knot. Clara tried to imagine a map of the streets. How many entrances converged on this block? Joshua silently counted the distance to the last side street before the alley that connected to the freeway on-ramp. Vega looked at Ruiz. He gave no command, only a brief tilt of the head that said, "Wait, not yet." A lamp wick inside one of the lanterns hissed and flared, then steadied. Its glare made the shadows deeper at the perimeter of the circle. Suddenly, without warning, a metallic clang from the direction of the hardware store door came again, this time followed by the echo of a latch snapping back. Someone tried the handle from outside, forcing it just enough to test the give. A woman standing near the center gasped, then clapped a hand over her mouth. Mrs. Farley glanced sharply at the sound, but said nothing. Ruiz spoke in a voice that carried just enough to be heard by those nearest the door. "Don't approach it. If they get in there, they'll still have to come out. We hold corners, not chase." The door rattled once more, then stopped. A dull silence followed, with only the small creaks of the building's old frame settling. From the roof, a faint cough of debris tumbled down the side of the laundromat. A few pebbles hit the pavement near the gutter, rolling until they tapped against the curb. Ton caught a glint of something on the rail yard side again, movement among the pallets or behind them. This time he saw a shoulder and the brief outline of a head before it slid back out of sight. He signaled to the nearest residents by raising his hand slightly. Clara sensed rather than saw that more of the neighbors were beginning to recede mentally, worn down by the relentless tension. Her jaw tightened as she reminded herself to stay present, to keep scanning, even when her eyes burned from the strain. Then the voice from the roof spoke again. Closer, firmer, quieter. 3 minutes. It didn't taunt. It didn't rage. It was measured, almost gentle in its patience. The word seemed absurd at first. 3 minutes until what? But the certainty behind them flooded the air like static. Miguel took a step out from the lobby, ignoring the quick warning glance from Amanda. Even injured, he refused to remain hidden while a clock wound down around them. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Clara inhaled through her nose, steadying herself. Joshua felt his pulse thudding in his throat. Ruiz stayed silent, but every muscle in his frame coiled. Vega spoke barely above a whisper, more to Ruiz and Joshua than anyone else. "We don't move until they show. If we scatter now, they'll exploit it." The faint running footsteps from earlier resumed, now from a different direction, as if someone circled the blocked perimeter again. Then they faded once more, replaced by near total silence. A hush deeper than the one before settled over the street as though the night itself were holding its breath. Even the wind paused in its lazy rattling of signs and loose crates. Every set of eyes trained upward or outward, waiting for any clue to what 3 minutes meant. And though not a soul said it aloud, they all shared the same unspoken realization. The intruders were not stalling. They were synchronizing. Whatever was coming next was the reason they had waited so long in the shadows, and the blackout was their ally, not their obstacle. Somewhere in the darkness above, the figure near the ventilation duct remained crouched, poised like a thought no one could shake, and far beyond the reach of any lantern light. Others answered that unspoken countdown by shifting into position. The tension rippled outward as if the street itself sensed the count ticking down. Every muscle, every breath, every blink seemed to brace for something unseen drawing nearer. The words 3 minutes clung to every mind, stretching time and compressing it at once. Ruiz lifted his chin slightly, listening with an intensity that made the silence feel brittle. The lantern glow across his cheekbones trembled faintly as the breeze shifted again, but he never turned his head from the rooftops. Vega took a slow step sideways, placing herself at a sharper angle between the main group and the mouth of the alley, as though expecting something to rush from either point. Even in the dark, the faint reflection in her eyes flickered like a fuse waiting for the spark. From behind the pallets near the fence, a low scrape came again. This time, unmistakably the sound of fabric brushing against corrugated metal. Tan's hand closed around his flashlight with a tight grip, though he didn't raise it nor switch it on. His other hand motioned for the residents nearest him to stay low and remain in the light. Eleanor's gaze snapped from the rail yard shadows to the hardware store briefly, then up to the roof. She could not see the figure behind the vent anymore, but she felt its attention like a beam trained on her forehead. Clara's heartbeat pounded against her ribs, yet her mind kept forcing focus outward. In her periphery, she noticed two neighbors subtly angle themselves so they could shield a child crouched near the curb without drawing attention. Joshua adjusted the lantern again, the hinge creaking once before he steadied it. The flame dipped, caught, and then glowed stronger, stretching the halo of light a few inches further across the pavement. It wasn't enough to reveal movement, but enough to remind everyone that they were not consumed wholly by darkness. Harry and Callum, still crouched near the alley's mouth, exchanged a single glance. Callum's breath stayed shallow, controlled. Harry's jaw flexed once. Somewhere deeper in the alley, something metallic tapped with the consistency of a drip, only there was no water. In the lobby, Amanda stood now, not seated, her blanket pulled around her feet like shed skin. Miguel stepped closer to the doorway, though he remained half-turned toward the stairwell. He listened not only for threats outside, but the possibility that whatever counted down those minutes might strike from within. Mrs. Farley was the first to speak again, her voice soft but penetrating. "Hold your ground. They want fear to scatter us. Stay where eyes can see you and where you can move together." No one answered aloud, but a few postures straightened, the communal instinct reinforced. A faint hiss of brush against brick rose from above the laundromat, like someone shifting their weight to a better vantage. Then came the dull clack of something wooden or metal settling in place on the roof of the next building over, almost in chain. Clara counted the seconds in her head without meaning to. The phrase 3 minutes had etched itself across her perception. She didn't know when it started or how long had already bled into the waiting, but she could feel the moment nearing something inevitable. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the old payphone alcove near the rail yard fence. The broken receiver still dangled by its cord. In the faint light, she noticed the cord sway once, though no breeze touched it. Joshua caught that too and felt his gut twist. He raised the lantern another inch, and the receiver stilled, as if whoever tested it let go. Farther down the street, a soft whomp sounded, muffled like someone leaping down in a sand or heavy cloth. It didn't echo sharply, which meant the landing was cushioned or carefully executed. Someone had changed positions, likely dismounting from one roof to another lower platform. Ruiz finally moved, just a fraction. He pivoted his foot, but did not step. His shoulder angled slightly to face the direction of that muted thud. His voice came so low it nearly fused with the night. 1 minute. Whether he meant it as a guess, an instinct, or a warning, no one asked. But the 3 words slid through the group like cold water over stone. Ton risked a small glance at the 2 men near the trash bins. One of them swallowed and wiped his palms on his jeans. The other pressed his back against a lamppost with wires hanging dead from its bulb socket. Near the building's entrance, a pair of teenagers stood close to the ground-level window, gripping a crowbar and a length of pipe. They weren't trained, they weren't particularly strong, but they refused to hide. The boards on the window behind them rattled slightly when they shifted weight. Eleanor's breath thinned as another sound arrived, this time from behind the laundromat. Fabric sliding against gravel, and then a soft grunt under breath. Too controlled to be panic. Someone positioning themselves in silence. Clara heard it too. She looked toward the roof line and scanned for movement, but everything above remained a silhouette of vents, chimneys, and ducts. Joshua noticed a new sound from far off down the street. A vehicle's tire rolling slowly over debris. Not a car driving, not a large truck, but something lighter coasting, maybe pushed by hand. It moved for a moment, then halted again. It didn't retreat. It waited. From the alley, Callum heard the metallic tapping halt. Then a single crunch of gravel. He lifted his flashlight slightly, but kept the beam off. Harry reached out and steadied his arm without looking at him. The faint scratch of a zipper or canvas strap rubbing against cloth drifted down from the hardware store roof. Then came a barely audible murmur, too soft to comprehend, but filled with the tone of readiness. In the lobby, Miguel whispered to Amanda, "Stay near the hallway, but keep your eyes out there." She nodded without protest, her hands now free of the blanket, fingers flexing nervously. Outside, the lantern's flames twitched in unison as a fresh gust of air funneled through the street. This time the breeze carried a distant smell, ozone, maybe, or the scorched tang of old wiring, or something else none of them had felt in the air until now. Eleanor blinked once, realizing she could sense more than hear new footsteps approaching from the direction of the rail yard's far exit. Barely perceptible, as if whoever walked there never wanted to be fully silent, but also never fast enough to draw a chase. Someone near the semicircle dry whispered, "I can't see them." The voice trembled more with frustration than fear. Mrs. Farley answered in the same hush, "You're not supposed to. Just stay ready." Ruiz's eyes finally lifted to the dark sky overhead. The night looked too still, too breathless, as if something pressed on it from above, and the buildings crouched beneath it like animals sensing a change in air pressure. Vega's posture tightened. Her fingers brushed the edge of her jacket near her side. She leaned barely forward, poised not to attack, but to intercept. Another muffled thud from the rail yard fence line. Then a quiet rasp of wood dragged across pavement. Ton saw a silhouette there now, hunched and purposeful, try to move an object or signal someone else in minimal motion. Eleanor counted that shape as at least the third confirmed presence beyond the alley watchers and roof figures. Clara silently matched that tally. Joshua held his lantern steadier than before, though the weight of the handle dug into his palm painfully. In the distance, The rolling object on wheels creaked once as someone maybe steadied it. Then silence resumed with a density that made each heartbeat feel amplified. No countdown voice followed, no whispered cue from above. But every listener understood the next breath of night would bring an action that had been stalled for too long. And although not a single person in the group could name the shape of the danger, all of them braced in their own way. To leap forward, to shield, to strike, to gather, to endure. The blackout wrapped the block in its heavy arms, and something unseen moved just beyond the rim of every lantern's reach, about to declare itself at last. A crack no louder than a breath split the hush, wood against metal or metal against bone. No one could tell. It came from somewhere between the laundromat and the hardware store roof, a diagonal corner of darkness where even lantern reflections could not cling. Ruiz's head turned in that direction, his eyes narrowing by instinct rather than sight. Vega adjusted her stance a half step, body angled like a drawn bow. A pulse of sound followed, quieter but distinct. 2 taps, a pause, then a third. It wasn't the earlier rhythm, but a new signal, sharper, faster, as if confirming alignment. The kind of sound meant to mark readiness without drawing attention. In the rail yard's corner, the silhouette Ton spotted earlier shifted again, and this time he saw it rise, not crouch. A flash of an elbow, a small pack at the hip, too organized for a stray wanderer. His breath slowed, waiting to see if it would climb or retreat. At the same moment, the distant runner's steps, if it was the same person, resurfaced from the direction of the industrial blocks a few streets over. Not rushing now, but pacing with a cadence that echoed faintly off the hollow buildings, just enough to mark their position without revealing intent. A new noise teased the edges of everyone's hearing, a soft, swirling resonance like wind funneled through a large vent. But no wind moved the trees, and no flag stirred on poles. The sound was too focused, too deliberate. Then, without warning, a distant horn or siren fragment, barely a half note, broke from far across the city, muffled as though trapped behind doors or swallowed by the darkness. It didn't repeat. It might not even have been real, yet its echo clung to the silence like residue. Eleanor's eyes darted toward the rail yard fence line again. In the dim, she saw a different shape, taller, holding what might have been a compact tool or a short baton in one hand. It stood still for just a moment before sinking back behind stacked pallets. Clara caught the tail of that same movement and felt the skin on her arms prickle. She clutched her coat, sleeve to keep from moving impulsively. Joshua watched the alley now, convinced something would emerge from there first. His lantern flickered once, and he lifted it closer to his chest to block any gust that might snuff the flame. Down the semicircle, one of the men posted near the bins inhaled sharply as he noticed a shadow slide behind the large green dumpster at the far corner of the block. He couldn't tell if it dropped from above or crept in from the flank, only that it was new and hadn't been there minutes ago. Mrs. Farley's eyes tracked the same spot a heartbeat later. She did not speak a warning, but the line of her mouth thinned. The others near her followed her gaze and tightened their postures. In the lobby, Miguel shifted his weight, but his movement stayed silent. Amanda stepped back a pace only so she could see more of the street through the gap in the doorway. She kept her hands close to the wall, as though touching something solid could anchor her fear. The countdown, though no longer verbalized, ticked in every head. No one dared check a watch or count aloud. They only felt it. Harry and Callum, still crouched in the alley's mouth, heard a dull friction sound from atop the short awning behind them, like someone sliding into a prone position. Callum almost turned his flashlight on then, but Harry's hand on his wrist froze him mid-motion. The darkness above held something, perhaps someone lying flat. From the roof above, another faint click came, then another, stuttered, as though relaying the same message to someone out of earshot. A small piece of gravel dislodged and tumbled down the slanted siding, landing soundlessly in the dust. A child whimpered once behind neighbor's leg. The man pressed a comforting hand to the child's shoulder without bending down or speaking. The rancid scent of old oil drifted in as the breeze curled around the dumpsters. A slight metallic twang, maybe a tension cable shifting, rose and fell so quickly it could have been imagined. Then a shadow at the far end of the street, barely visible, darker than the dark, moved with pace across the intersection, heading toward them but staying close to building edges. It glided quickly, not sloppy or scattered. The form passed behind a burnt-out delivery van and vanished from sight. Clara and Eleanor both spotted that same movement from different angles and exchanged a split-second look. Nothing needed to be said. Whoever that was belonged to the same network that had been circling for hours. Joshua turned slightly, catching the motion too late to see it clearly, but the shifting lantern light near the van confirmed something had blocked it briefly. A single vertical creak issued from the old metal fire escape 2 buildings over. Ton's head snapped up in time to see a foot retract behind the platform railing. Ruiz finally spoke, not loudly, but with a tone that carried to those listening closest. "Stay tight. Watch the edges. They're not scattering anymore." Vega didn't nod, but her stance shifted into readiness. The weight in her voice earlier had not been assumption. She knew the pattern of coordinated positions closing. A distinctly soft thud struck the ground near the side wall of the antique shop, as if someone had hopped down from a chest-high perch. Then came the nearly inaudible scuff of a soul catching pavement. Eleanor rotated a fraction, eyes narrowing at the building's edge. The scuff came again, but further down, suggesting more than one individual moving in tandem but offset. A low hum, impossibly faint but steady, drifted from somewhere beyond the rail yard's fence, like a generator trying not to wake its neighbors, or a motorcycling in preparation. Joshua felt the vibration in his bones rather than heard it with certainty. He glanced at Ruiz, who registered the same resonance with a flaring tension in his jaw. The man near the bins whispered to his friend, "They're surrounding the sound, not us." But his voice was too thin to carry beyond that corner. Suddenly, a soft grunt, sharp and short, broke from above the laundromat. It sounded like someone bracing themselves before a drop or suppressing a reaction to pain. Moments later, a puff of loose dust drifted from the roof's edge, catching a sliver of lantern glow before disappearing midair. Clara's heart hammered harder. Eleanor's fists tightened reflexively. Without warning, a second sound crackled from the hardware store rooftop, this time the squeak of a rubber sole pivoting on metal, followed by a faint clatter that someone caught mid-fall. In the alley, Callum heard breathing above him now, slow and controlled, like air pushed through a mask or scarf. He refused to look up, knowing the angle could expose his face to whoever watched from above. Harry shifted just slightly to the right, so he could cover more of the alley's entry if something dropped down. A tiny glint flashed near the rail yard fence, a metal object catching lantern light for a fraction of a second. Ton squinted, catching its arc as it moved behind a barrel. It wasn't a blade or gun, but some kind of tool or signal piece. Ruiz's voice, barely a murmur, broke the stretch of breaths. Eyes sharp, the sound beyond the rail yard fence deepened, a low mechanical rumble that coughed twice, then steadied. It didn't roar, but whispered its ignition, some kind of small engine coming awake in the dark. Vega, hearing it, angled her chin just enough to see the top of the pallets where shadows tensed and shifted. Joshua braced his lantern on his forearm to keep it steady without shaking. Clara's ears rang with the silence between sounds, each small movement amplified in the void. Eleanor could feel the collective pulse of the group sinking, as though preparing for a shock. Mrs. Farley's expression hardened with something like grim acceptance. She looked once toward the lobby doors, making sure Miguel and Amanda remained ready. Miguel met her eyes briefly from the threshold. His grip on the doorframe tightened, not to close it but to hold his place. A hiss of static abruptly burst from the old radio again. Brief, louder than before, and jagged with interference. It crackled once, twice, then cut off, leaving only the aftersound echoing in everyone's ears. The moment it died, a new voice sounded from the far edge of the rooftops. It was a woman's this time, low, controlled, and final. Move. The single word traveled across the blacked-out street like a match strike in the dark. It carried neither panic nor hesitation, only the clarity of a command long awaited. In the same instant, from 3 different corners came 3 distinct responses. A footfall dropping from a ledge, a scrape from behind a dumpster, and a thump near the fence, as if something large shifted into motion. The blackout did not flicker. No lights returned, no sirens blared, but something invisible finally stepped across whatever line had kept it waiting. And every person in the semicircle, on the alley's edge, in a lobby doorway, or posted near the bins felt the air itself bend with the force of that unseen convergence. The night had stopped warning them. It was about to reveal why it had waited. The first motion came not with a shout or rush, but a coordinated stir, as though the darkness itself released figures it had been holding in place. From behind the pallets near the fence, one silhouette broke into a swift glide toward the side of the hardware store, using the shadows cast by stacked crates as cover. Another slipped along the base of a laundromat, crouched low, their outline barely visible as they moved with purpose. A muted clang from the dumpster corner marked someone pulling themselves up the metal side, boots glancing off the frame before landing softly on top. The figure stayed low, using the discarded cardboard and trash bags piled there as concealment while scanning the semicircle of residents. Ruiz did not shout or move, but his weight shifted subtly to the balls of his feet. Vega's eyes followed the motion near the dumpster while her head angled slightly toward the rail yard, tracking the second figure. Joshua kept his lantern held steady in both hands. Light angled downward, casting long shadows rather than illuminating targets. Ton saw the shape near the pallets disappear behind the hardware store's low ridge. He blinked once, blinked again, unable to spot them until the faintest scuff hinted they were hugging the wall, inching closer to the main street. From above, the soft thud of someone dropping to a lower platform signaled movement from the roof of the laundromat or an adjacent building. A second, then a third set of feet followed at intervals so precise they could have been counted in heartbeats. Harry pressed a hand against the alley wall, anchoring himself as he listened to the breathing above him fade into a new direction. Callum's jaw tightened, but he stayed crouched, watching the passage like a coiled spring. Clara scanned the rooftop edges, unsure which side the command had originated from. The female voice's even tone lingered in her ears, void of fear and heavy with certainty. Eleanor's shoulders squared. She tilted her head incrementally to listen behind the antique shop, where she thought she heard a groan of wood as someone tested a window or doorframe. From a far side of the street, the object on wheels moved at last, pushed or pulled, guided by unseen hands. It squeaked once as its axle ground over a crack in the pavement, then rolled into a shallow dip. The sound was controlled, like a tool cart or generator dolly being maneuvered into position. Mrs. Farley touched the arm of the man nearest her, a silent cue to stay grounded. The man swallowed hard and gripped the length of pipe he held so tight his knuckles whitened. Miguel stepped 1 foot onto the lobby's outer threshold, careful not to draw attention with noise. Amanda, now partially shielded behind the doorframe, leaned just enough to peer past him, her breath catching when she caught motion near the rail yard fence. A figure scaled the midsection of the fence with practiced ease, using protruding bolts as footholds. The silhouette reached the top, paused in a crouch, then swung over and dropped onto the inside. The landing was so quiet, it could have been mistaken for a trick of the eye, if not for the faint click of gravel under boots. Ruiz's eyes tracked that landing, the only betrayal of his tension being the slow lift of his chin. Vega recognized the movement too, silently recalibrating the number of threats now inside the perimeter of buildings. Joshua caught another flicker at the opposite end of the street. Someone moving low along the curb, using parked cars and trash bins as intermittent cover. He didn't swing the lantern that way for fear of giving away their exact positions. Tan's heartbeat had settled into a rhythm of its own, but the muscles in his neck were cords of strain. He tracked 2 separate directions, one near the fence, one above the rooftops, trying to determine which would strike first. Then came a distant signal, 3 faint metallic clicks, evenly spaced from somewhere beyond the rail yard's far fence. Immediately after, a soft, single thrum of that hidden engine rose by a fraction, then held steady again. Clara's mind raced to piece together an explanation. Equipment, transport, an extraction or insertion point. The pieces slotted into the edges of her imagination without forming a full picture. Eleanor realized the lanterns around them were suddenly insufficient. Shadows lay even deeper now, not because the flames weakened, but because movement distorted the street's geometry. Callum flinched as something overhead shifted again, the scrape of cloth on metal traveling away from their position. Harry angled his head minutely, tracking the route with his ears. From the roof near the hardware store, a gloved hand appeared briefly at the ledge before vanishing again. The figure crouched there angled its weight as though preparing to descend the fire escape ladder. At the same time, the person above the laundromat exhaled just loudly enough for Eleanor to hear a breath carried on the still air. Not fear, focus. Joshua took a slow step backward so as not to collide with anyone behind him. The lantern's flame flickered, then steadied, its glow glancing off a window pane with enough shimmer to cast a faint highlight across a rooftop vent. Mrs. Farley caught that shimmer and located a second shadow perched there, one she had not seen before. This one moved differently, more upright, scanning with small head motions. The quiet creak of the dumpster pile gave away the one crouched there, repositioning to get a better vantage. The cardboard rustled faintly under their weight. Miguel listened for any shift from inside the building. None came, but a new unease crawled along his skin. He glanced behind him to ensure no back stair creaked out of place. Amanda blinked slowly, trying not to look at any single threat for too long. Her eyes stung from straining in the dark, but she refused to turn away. Tan glanced toward Ruiz and Vega, but neither gave a signal to advance, retreat, or shout. The silence of command remained intact. They would wait, absorb, and respond only when the line was truly breached. Then, 2 muffled pops sounded near the rail yard, too soft to be gunfire, too shaped to be debris. It was followed by the slide of something heavy being drawn a short distance. A third pop, closer now, came from behind the hardware store. It synced with the rumble of the unseen engine, as though acknowledging the signal. Clara felt something shift in the air, not temperature or wind, but intent. She sensed the convergence tightening from all sides, pressing against the group like invisible walls. Eleanor's fingertips twitched, craving something to hold, though. She kept her hands still at her sides. Joshua braced his stance, one foot back, one forward for balance rather than running. Mrs. Farley's voice, barely a murmur, threaded through the tension. Do not break ranks. Let them reveal their turn. No one answered, but the warning settled deep. From the rooftop where the female voice had first given the command, a secondary voice, male, younger, spoke in a tone almost dismissive. On your mark. The words dropped like stones into a well. They were not shouted, but they carried enough clarity to strike fear deeper than threats. Somewhere behind the alloy of buildings, another series of clicks responded, each from a different direction. 3, 2, then 1. Ruiz exhaled once, breath shallow but controlled. Vega centered her weight. Joshua's lantern flame quivered with a faint tremor in his grip. The next sound came so quietly it nearly passed unnoticed. A door hinge turning on unoiled metal somewhere beyond the antique shop's rear wall. A second hinge followed after a pause, as though someone had eased pressure off to keep it muted. Tan watched the rooftop edges again, expecting the first descent. Clara tuned her ears to the alley, waiting for a footfall from above Callum and Harry. Eleanor tracked the faint mechanical throb behind the fence, though it was too far to decipher. And then from the far side of the street, where the rolling cart had stopped, the hush snapped as the object shifted with a sudden scrape. Louder this time, uncontrolled, as though someone lost their grip for half a second. In that slip, the darkness exhaled with them. Every figure already in motion quickened by a breath, and the residents holding their line felt the inevitable threshold widen in front of them, no longer hiding behind silence, but stepping forward to wear it like armor. The scrape was followed by a hush so abrupt it seemed the entire street had been holding its breath. The cart, or whatever was balanced on it, settled into stillness again, but the damage was already done. That tiny slip had peeled back the last layer of stealth, and everyone on both sides of the divide understood it. From the rooftop above the laundromat, the first figure moved. Not a leap, not a rush, more a deliberate shift of balance. One foot lowering onto a rusted ladder rail with a patience that bordered on ceremony. The metal let out a dull clink, the kind that should not have been audible at this distance. Yet in the silence it might as well have been a chime. Across the street, behind the hardware store, another figure detached from the wall and began sliding along the edge of the building, their silhouette threading between stacked crates and the shadow of a water tank. The lantern light from Joshua's hand barely touched them, offering only a suggestion of limbs in motion. Tan's eyes darted to that movement, but he did not speak or alert the others. His breath shallowed further, a silent surrender to the moment's gravity. Joshua adjusted his grip, not to raise the lantern as a weapon, but to brace it, ready to swing light where needed. The flame inside trembled, but it held its shape, stubborn against the darkness closing in. Ruiz rotated his shoulders slightly, drawing a slow breath through his nose. He remained silent, but the readiness in his stance echoed like a command. Vega's gaze tracked 3 separate vectors of motion, even as her feet remained rooted. The patience she carried was tactical, not hesitant. Clara swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears. Her mind flickered to the voice of the woman who had first spoken, and she wondered if that same voice would announce whatever came next, or if the time for warnings had passed. Eleanor's heartbeat thudded in her temples, but her posture revealed none of it. She watched the rooftop figures like she might watch the horizon for a storm, not in fear, but in calculation. Callum shifted his weight just enough to ease a cramp in his knee. Harry steadied his breathing, eyes trained on the alley's upper edge. Mrs. Farley remained still, though the man beside her cast her a nervous glance, as if waiting for permission to blink. Miguel heard a subtle scuff near the fire exit behind him, too soft to confirm, but not imagine. He pressed his shoulder to the frame, unsure whether to check or stand ground. Amanda gripped the metal edge of the door with one hand, grounding herself as she peered through the darkness with burning eyes. Above the dumpster, the crouched figure adjusted their stance. The cardboard shifted under their boots with a faint grind, and then their head tilted downwards, studying the semicircle of neighbors as though taking count. Another figure joined them from the rooftop's far side, crouching behind a broken skylight. Only the faintest crest of their silhouette betrayed their arrival. From the rail yard fence, the engine thrummed one note higher before settling again, as if its operator had acknowledged the slip and recentered the timing. Then, unexpectedly, a voice rose, not from the rooftops, not from the shadows, but from behind the fence beyond the rail yard. It was low but traveled cleanly, shaped like muscle memory rather than conversation. Hold alignment. 2 words. Quiet, crisp, without accent or emotion. They didn't belong to the woman from before, nor to the younger man. This one was older, weathered by use, the kind of tone that didn't need to be raised to command. In the same breath, the figure perched by the laundromat froze mid-step on the ladder. The one behind the hardware store paused in motion, one hand hovering near the corner of the wall. The rooftop presences seemed to congeal, suspended in place like shadows, waiting for permission to exist again. Joshua caught the shift immediately. The lantern's glow caught the side of Ruiz's face, and he saw the same recognition in the man's eyes. This wasn't a scattered group improvising in the darkness. It was structure, sequence, intent. Ton's knuckles pressed against his thigh, grounding himself as panic threatened to surge. He didn't let it rise. Not yet. Clara inhaled through her nose, slow and silent, the taste of night air thick against her tongue. Eleanor only blinked once. Vega lowered her gaze for a moment, calculating the distance from each moving piece to the circle of residents. Mrs. Farley's chin lifted a fraction, defiance or focus. It was hard to tell. The silence after the order was different from the silence before it. This one had shape direction. It sat in the spaces between street lamps and rooftops like a living thing, coiled and watchful. Then came the rustle of fabric, not from one place, but several. Figures resumed motion, but slower, more controlled, like pieces on a board sliding into formation rather than attacking. Near the hardware store, the silhouette that had pressed along the wall now angled inward toward the main road. Their steps were nearly silent, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer probing, they were positioning. On the roof, the one by the ladder adjusted their footing and stepped back instead of down, ready but restrained. The two near the skylight sank lower, one peering through the broken glass into the darkened laundromat below. From behind the crates at the fence line, another figure rose to a half-crouch, watching the residents through a slit between wooden slats, their breath steady and controlled. Joshua could feel the weight of dozens of unseen eyes now. They had been watched before, but this was different. This wasn't assessment, it was convergence. Ruiz's jaw flexed once. Vega glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, and in that glance they exchanged something wordless, acknowledgement of the field they were standing on. Callum let his hand drift closer to the ground, ready to push off if needed. Harry braced his heels. Miguel kept one hand on the doorframe and the other relaxed to the side, as though ready to pull someone in or push someone out. Amanda's breath trembled, but she didn't break her gaze. Clara's fingertips curled slightly against her coat, though her face remained composed. Eleanor's boots shifted a few inches apart, a stance chosen deliberately without drawing attention. Ton closed his eyes for the space of a blink and listened. No whispers, no footsteps, no clatter. Just tension wearing human shapes. The cart on the far side of the street gave another tiny wheeze as something atop it settled, like metal shifting under cloth. Joshua's lantern flame bowed in a faint draft none of them could feel. And then, from the same direction as the older voice, a second command came, not louder, but closer to finality. Advance to contact. The words fell like a gate unlatched. No one rushed. No one broke into a charge. Instead, shapes peeled from the darkness with the slow, certain steps of those who had counted every exit and measured every breath of those before them. One figure emerged first, a tall outline crossing from the alley beside the laundromat, gliding into the dim stretch of road where the cracked asphalt shimmered with lantern light. They did not sprint or threaten. They simply arrived, shoulders squared, steps even. A second moved from behind the dumpster stack, coming down into the open with the same unhurried calm. The cardboard gave a soft crunch as they stepped off it. From the hardware store's roofline, a shadow descended the fire escape with enough silence to suggest they had done it 1,000 times. The circle of residents said nothing, shifted nothing, yet the air between both sides tightened to a thread. The first figure stopped just outside the reach of Joshua's lantern glow. Their face was still hidden by the dark, but the outline of their posture suggested they were neither afraid nor aggressive, only determined. Behind them, more silhouettes gathered at staggered distances, not clustering but spreading into a wide arc, each positioned as though part of some invisible geometry. No one on either side spoke, but the night, once thick with quiet, now held the shape of something about to be named. The arc of silhouettes did not tighten or close in. They held position with a precision that suggested each one knew exactly how much space to leave between themselves and the next. The formation wasn't a trap snapping shut. It was a presence being declared. Joshua adjusted his lantern slightly, angling it just enough that the rim of its light grazed the boots of the first figure. The leather was worn but cared for, the laces double-bound, the stance firm without theatrics. Whoever they weren't improvising their role in this. Ruiz let a breath ease out through his nose, small and controlled. His shoulders didn't rise, his hands didn't flex, but something in his focus narrowed even further. Vega didn't blink for several seconds, tracing the placement of every figure in the arc. Her mind ticked through each alley, doorway, and vantage point they had already seated without contest. Ton felt the pressure of silence like weight on his collarbones. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their eyes, even the ones still perched on rooftops above. Clara's thoughts flickered through possibilities. Were they military? Mercenaries? Survivors from another district? Organized squatters? None of the options settled cleanly in her mind. Eleanor's gaze shifted between the first three figures and the rooftops they had emerged from. She didn't look down, didn't look away. If fear was there, it hid behind something sturdier. Callum's heel dug slightly into the pavement. A subtle anchor in case motion exploded without warning. Harry narrowed his eyes, trying to mark which shadow moved with which breath. Miguel remained angled in the doorway. Amanda, just behind him, steadied herself against the frame, her face ashen but resolute. Mrs. Farley did not speak, did not twitch, but the man beside her adjusted his grip on the pipe with a faint metallic tap. Joshua took in a new detail, footsteps but softer than before. Someone else was moving behind the arc, not in a rush, not closing in, but navigating the formation like they had built it themselves. The engine behind the fence thrummed once and went still. The sudden absence of the sound, made the street feel even more hollow, like the night had dropped something it no longer needed. Then, a new figure stepped forward from the deeper dark beyond the first silhouette. Taller than the others, shoulders slightly forward, coat long enough to brush the sides of their boots. No light reached their face, and yet their arrival shifted the tension again, like another piece just clicked into place. The first figure, the one closest to the lantern's glow, finally moved. Only a small pivot, turning halfway toward the taller newcomer as though awaiting instruction or confirmation. No words passed between them, yet Joshua could tell some signal had been exchanged. He felt the hair rise on his arms, but he did not raise the lantern higher. Ton noticed the absence of twitchy nerves in the newcomers. Whoever they were, none of them flinched from shadow or noise. They behaved like people who had rehearsed being ghosts. Clara caught the faintest flicker of reflection from something the tall figure adjusted near their wrist. Metal maybe, or glass. Eleanor watched the rooftops again. The silhouettes stationed there hadn't abandoned their vantage points. They were leaning forward now, watching their own people as much as the residents. Callum saw another glint by the rail yard fence. Someone crouched low, monitoring the ark's edges. Harry counted quietly in his head. 1, 2, 3 for on ground level within view, at least 3 above, 2 still unaccounted for by sound. Minimum 9. Miguel felt Amanda stiffen behind him. He leaned subtly backward, enough that she would know he was still there without turning around. Vega quietly mapped escape routes in her mind, not because she intended to run, but because knowing the exits gave her power over the unknown. Mrs. Farley finally let her lips part by the smallest margin, not to speak, but to breathe deeper, calmer. Then, without fanfare, the tall figure lifted one hand. Not high, not in surrender or aggression, just a deliberate lift, palm angled slightly inward, fingers relaxed. Every other silhouette stilled even more, as if they had been moving microscopically and only now froze. The tall figure didn't speak, but someone else did. From the left side of the formation, near the line of parked cars, a voice emerged. Female, composed, but not the same one who had spoken before. This one carried a different cadence, lower, measured. You've held position longer than most would. She did not step forward as she spoke. Her words floated across the space between the two groups without rushing, without lacing themselves in mockery or threat. Joshua almost answered, not out of impulse, but instinct. Ruiz's head tilted a fraction, the closest thing to acknowledgement he'd shown. Ton swallowed. Clara blinked slowly. Eleanor barely moved her eyes. The woman continued, just as calmly. We're not here for surprise. That moment is gone. All of you see that. A quiet creak overhead signaled a shift on the rooftop. It sounded more like someone settling their foot than repositioning for assault. The tall figure lowered their hand again. The woman's tone never changed as she added, "So now we speak with the lights still off, or we don't speak at all?" No one in the residence line moved. The lantern's glow fluttered once before steadying again. Between the two groups, the night waited, no longer silent by accident, but by agreement neither side had declared out loud. Joshua didn't lift the lantern any higher, but he angled it just slightly, letting its outer edge catch a sliver of dust in the air between them. That faint shimmer marked the gap, an invisible threshold neither side had stepped over yet. Ruiz finally spoke, his voice low enough that it didn't feel like it cut into the night so much as leaned into it. You made your entrance quiet. Make your reason just as clear. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't demand names or outcomes. He set terms without sounding like he expected them honored. Ton held his breath, surprised Ruiz had broken the silence first. Vega didn't glance at him, but the turn of her head suggested she had expected exactly that. The female voice from the parked cars answered. Clarity depends on what's already known. Her tone didn't sharpen, but it carried, and what's already assumed. The tall figure remained still, neither confirming nor contradicting her words. Eleanor shifted her gaze to him, the way he stood, the space he commanded without speaking. Clara did the same, curious if he would stay silent the entire time. Mrs. Farley murmured just loud enough for the circle to hear. Words cost less than spilling blood. The sentence carried no plea, only fact. Harry and Callum didn't move, but something in their shoulders eased a fraction at her tone. Joshua finally responded, voice steady. Then say what you came to say. No challenge, no invitation, just a line across the dark for them to decide how to cross. For a heartbeat, no one from the Ark answered. Then, the woman near the cars spoke again. We're not scavengers, not raiders, not looking to take what you've stacked in basements and closets. She paused, letting that intention land. We're passing through, but not blind. Ruiz's eyes narrowed a degree, not in disbelief, but in assessment. Ton glanced at the crates, rooftops, and fire escapes where the silhouettes still perched. Passing through didn't usually involve that much positioning. The woman continued. We don't force our way through places that stand their ground. You've done that without chaos. That's rare. Joshua said nothing. Vega stayed silent. The lantern's flame wavered once and steadied. From the rooftop above the laundromat, a voice called down quietly. This one the younger man who had said on your mark earlier. There's movement 3 blocks east. Not ours. His tone suggested the update wasn't new, just now urgent enough to mention. The tall figure turned his head just slightly in that direction. A gesture from him, small and almost imperceptible, caused 2 of the silhouettes on the ground to shift their stance, as if bracing for something not yet visible. Clara registered it immediately. Eleanor did too. Miguel felt the change behind him, like pressure building behind the walls rather than in front of them. Amanda whispered, barely audible. They're worried about something else. Mrs. Farley's eyes flicked toward her, but didn't correct or encourage the thought. Joshua finally asked, why scout rooftops and alleys for a place you're only passing through? The female voice didn't bristle. If anything, she sounded faintly impressed. Because places like this don't always let travelers pass. Harry recognized the truth in that, even if he didn't want to voice it. Ruiz shifted 1 foot, a deliberate move to show he was neither retreating nor advancing. You've mapped us without speaking to us, and you've held your line without testing ours, the woman replied. Vega traced the edge of the arc with her eyes. None of the figures held weapons visibly, but none of them stood in ways that suggested they weren't armed. From the rail yard fence, the engine made a soft mechanical tick, cooling or waiting. It was hard to tell which. Then, without looking at the woman, the tall figure finally spoke. His voice was low, even, and worn from use. We don't want your homes or your food. He spoke like someone stating logistics, not reassurance. We don't want her dead or your living. We need 1 night's passage and quiet behind us. Joshua felt the slightest pull at the back of his mind, an unease that came not from threat, but from implication. Passage through meant passage from something. Tom looked at Ruiz, expecting him to answer. Instead, it was Clara who spoke next. Quiet behind you, she echoed, not accusing, clarifying. Which direction does the noise come from? The tall figure didn't answer immediately. The woman near the cars filled the pause. East, and growing. Ruiz blinked once. Eleanor tilted her head. Vega's jaw tightened. Callum's eyes darted between the group and the far street beyond the antique shop. Harry imagined the empty avenues stretching that direction, dark and unbounded. Mrs. Farley lowered her voice, but not enough to bury the words. What follows you? The tall figure's silhouette lifted its chin slightly. Not a chase. Not yet. But a shift. He paused, as though deciding how much mattered. You'll hear it if you haven't already. Ton strained his ears. Nothing came from the east but distance. Clara thought of the flickering lights days ago, the odd sound she heard before the blackout. Eleanor remembered the first night of silence that wasn't silence at all. Joshua let the lantern dip a little, light sliding off the boots of the nearest figure and pooling uselessly on the ground. The tall figure continued. We came through the dark because the dark is the only thing they don't use yet. Ruiz asked the question no one else wanted to shape. They? The woman answered this time, not the tall man. Not people who want your walls. Not people who want ours either. Just people moving in the wrong direction. Her tone made the word wrong sound heavier than hostile. Vega finally spoke for the first time since this began. How many? The woman hesitated, not out of uncertainty, out of care for the word that would follow. Enough, she said. Silence folded over them again, thicker than before, full of maps none of them could see yet. The tall figure shifted 1 foot back, not retreating, not advancing. We hold formation until we pass. You hold your line until you choose not to. After that, the night decides what it keeps. He didn't wait for agreement. From the rooftops, one of the perched silhouettes adjusted position, gaze lifting eastward. Joshua glanced at Ruiz. Ruiz didn't look back. The lantern flickered a second time. And somewhere far off, in the direction no one wanted to name, something shifted in the dark with a sound too distant to be real and too real to be ignored. The distant sound came again, not louder, but closer in intent. It rumbled like pressure under the skin of the city, a shifting of weight that did not belong to wind or animals or wandering debris. Joshua heard it first in his bones, then in his ears. The tall figure looked east without turning his body. The woman near the cars adjusted her stance, head tilted, as though counting a rhythm only she could hear. On the rooftops, the silhouettes turned in near unison, their attention no longer fixed on the residents, but on whatever swelled beyond the edge of sight. Ruiz scanned the street behind them, then the barricades they had built with their own hands. He had no illusions about strength in numbers when the numbers were unknown. Vega exhaled once, sharp and silent, the kind of breath people take before they decide not to run. Mrs. Farley's voice came soft, low, certain. If the night is moving, we don't stand in its way. Clara glanced at her, surprised at the finality in those words. Eleanor turned her head slightly in agreement. The tall figure finally looked at Ruiz, maybe not at his face, but at the space he occupied. We don't ask to stand with you, only that your eyes don't close when we pass. Ruiz nodded once. Not permission, not alliance. Something simpler, recognition. Joshua lowered the lantern a little more. The circle of residents did not break, but it opened, a breath wider, enough space at the far edge of the street to let the arc of strangers move. The tall figure signaled with only a turn of his wrist. 3 silhouettes from the rooftop began their descent, quiet and controlled. The ones near the fence stepped back from the carts and crates. The woman near the cars fell into motion without raising her voice again. They did not flood the road. They flowed through it, measured, silent, shaped by an urgency that made no noise. As they passed the lantern's edge, the flame trembled. Amanda, still near the doorway, counted no more than 9 of them, though she sensed there were more. Miguel held his ground, but did not block their path. Callum and Harry stepped just enough to one side, keeping the alley within reach. Clara watched their faces as the light brushed each one in fragments. No two looked the same, but all carried the same fatigue and focus. People who had seen something and refused to describe it out loud. Eleanor followed the tall figure's shadow with her eyes until it lengthened past the barricades. Tom listened to the sound from the east, realizing it was not a single noise at all, but many distant footsteps, engines, carts, voices. He couldn't tell. That was the worst of it. The woman with the calm voice was among the last to pass. As she crossed the faint line of lantern light, she spoke quietly, almost like she was speaking to herself, but the words belonged to everyone. You'll hear them before you see them. Don't wait to understand. No one answered. The final shadow slipped past the old street lamp near the edge of the block. For a moment, the only sound was the brittle rustle of leaves dragged along the pavement by a wind too light to feel. Then the engine from beyond the fence coughed to life again, once, twice, and went silent for good. Ruiz turned his head east. The others followed his gaze. Far down the avenue, the darkness thickened, not in color, but in presence. A low, rolling murmur trembled under the street, like a crowd breathing behind a wall. Miguel closed the door without latching it. Amanda stayed beside him, not hiding, just listening. Joshua lifted the lantern again, not to shine it forward, but to mark that they were still there. Clara spoke softly to no one in particular. We hold the night until it stops asking. Eleanor nodded once. Mrs. Farley rested a hand on the arm of the man beside her, steady but not fearful. Callum's stance firmed. Harry kept his eyes on the street's vanishing point. Ton stepped closer to the others, shoulders squared. Vega and Ruiz remained at the front, silent, ready. And in the distance, closer now, but still unseen, the unknown moved through the dark, searching for whatever ground had not yet decided if it would stand or break. No one spoke another word. The night was not over, but it knew where it stood now, and so did they.